Dare to enter the deep, dark wilderness. The whispering trees, the crunch of unseen footsteps, the eerie silence before terror strikes. These 3 true deep woods horror stories will chill you to the bone. As you listen, you may feel the creeping unease, the fear of the unknown lurking just beyond the shadows. But within the fear lies a strange thrill, a rush of adrenaline, the satisfaction of surviving the terror, the comfort of knowing it didn't happen to you. Or did it? Are you ready to experience the dread, the suspense, and the horrifying unknown? Then sit back, turn down the lights, and prepare for a journey into the darkest corners of the wilderness, where reality is more terrifying than fiction. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chilling tales. This happened quite some time ago, back in 2015, but it's a memory that will stick with me forever. I was around 21 years old at the time and still relatively new to my city. I had just come out of a difficult relationship, which left me in a not-so-great mental state, and I didn't know many people in town other than my ex and his friends. To meet new people, I turned to a dating or hookup app, hoping to find someone to casually hang out with, maybe even a friend with benefits. I ended up matching with a 25-year-old guy named Simon. We chatted on the app for a few days, during which he mentioned that he was in a band and living with his bandmates. He shared their music with me, which was just an audio clip on YouTube, featuring a still image of 4 or 5 guys playing rock instruments. One of them looked like him. The music was a unique blend of styles, though it wasn't really my cup of tea. Still, he seemed like a decent guy. After a few days of silence from him, I assumed that was the end of it and moved on. Then one day, while I was at work, I received a message from him apologizing for being busy and inviting me to a barbecue with his friends and bandmates in their yard. He explained that their band manager was providing them with the house to live in, but given that I had only seen one photo of him playing in the band, I suspected he might be stretching the truth about the band manager. I thought it was more likely that a bar manager friend was giving them a break on rent in exchange for performing at his bar, or something similar, so I didn't dwell on it too much. Normally, I would have declined an invitation to a barbecue at the home of someone I barely knew, but I was feeling quite bored and thought this could be a chance to tackle some social anxiety and possibly make some female friends since he described it as a sizable gathering. I plugged the neighborhood he provided into my maps and saw it was a suburban area filled with families. I figured that being in a yard on such a lovely summer day wouldn't be too risky, especially with neighbors likely outside. Plus, it was only a few train stops away from my workplace, and I'd be off in a few hours anyway. I did mention to him that I felt a bit uneasy about the whole situation since I didn't really know him well, but I decided I would swing by for a little while if I could avoid going inside his house. He assured me that was perfectly fine, which eased my nerves significantly. To make sure I wouldn't have to use the bathroom inside, I even refrained from drinking anything for the rest of my shift. The thought of attending a barbecue with unfamiliar faces made me anxious, especially since he hinted that it was already full swing. Plus, finding a specific address from the backyard seemed like it would be a challenge. So I asked Simon if he could meet me at the train station, as he mentioned it was just a short walk away. He agreed, and I informed him when I was leaving work and what time the maps indicated my train would arrive. I sent Simon a message around 5:30 to let him know I had reached the train station, but after scanning the area, I couldn't spot him. He texted back saying he was running late and suggested I start walking toward the neighborhood. As I was making my way across the expansive parking lot, I finally saw him slowly approaching. I recognized his outfit, bell-bottoms, which were quite rare for men, and long hair. However, up close, his face looked quite different from the pictures I had seen. It might have been some serious photo editing, but he appeared older than the 25-year-old guy in the photos, maybe by 5 to 10 years. Perhaps he used pictures of his brother or something, I wasn't sure. This was before AI, so I couldn't figure out how that was possible. Regardless, it raised a red flag for me, but I foolishly brushed it aside. Maybe he was just self-conscious, or perhaps he smoked a lot and didn't wear sunscreen and hadn't taken recent photos. All his pictures seemed candid, so I assumed. He wasn't much into selfies anyway. Besides, I was primarily there to make friends, so I tried not to judge his looks too harshly. It was evident he was already quite drunk, but given that many of my ex's friends were heavy drinkers, it didn't strike me as odd. After all, he was hosting a barbecue. However, the second red flag came soon after we arrived at the front door, when I reminded him that I wasn't entirely comfortable. As we entered the house, he reassured me that we only needed to pass through it to reach the backyard. I thought, fine, whatever, since this neighborhood wasn't one where you could easily stroll around the house to access the backyard. It made sense, considering we would have had to retrace our steps back to the main road to get to the alley, leading directly to the yard. I assumed he simply forgot my earlier mention of not wanting to go inside and didn't want to stir up any trouble, so I decided to go along with it. Once inside, he promptly shut the door and locked both the deadbolt and the knob behind me. While I didn't find this too strange, after all, many people lock their doors as a habit, it did give me an uneasy feeling for some reason. Then Simon mentioned that he'd love to show me around the house. I politely turned him down, reminding him that I was just there for the barbecue. He insisted that he and his bandmates had put a lot of effort into the house and felt really proud of it. At that moment, I started to feel quite skeptical because typically when guys shared stories that seemed exaggerated, they often revealed the truth by the time I reached their place. Still, I tried to convince myself that I was being unreasonable. After all, I was already in the house. He assured me it would be a quick tour. I knew it wasn't the best decision, but I had a knack for rationalizing red flags. To me, Simon still gave off a laid-back stoner vibe, and he didn't seem threatening. Just an awkward guy who struggled with communication and maybe told a few fibs, somewhat reminiscent of my ex who had been emotionally and verbally abusive, but never crossed certain lines. I figured the worst that might happen was that he would get too touchy, and I'd be labeled a prude for not sleeping with him. Clearly, my self-worth was lacking at the time, so I ultimately decided to go along with it. The tour began rather uneventfully, aside from the fact that the decor in the common areas looked like it had been selected by a middle-aged Martha Stewart enthusiast rather than a group of guys in a band or their pretend manager. Honestly, I wasn't sure whether this should make me feel better or worse. On one hand, it was clear. Although he was lying, it made me consider that perhaps it was just someone's mom's house, and she was away. He might not have wanted to admit that he was living at a friend's parents' place and didn't actually have a job or anything. I know, total red flag, but at the time, I could justify it in my mind. The bedroom doors were all shut, and the bathroom was pretty ordinary. When he showed me the kitchen, I glanced out the window and noticed there was no one in the backyard. No barbecue supplies, no burgers sizzling on the counter, and no cocktail items scattered about. Curious, I asked him where everyone was and why he had lied about the barbecue. He claimed that his bandmates were on tour but were running late due to some van issues, assuring me they would be back any moment so we could kick off the party. I questioned why he wasn't touring with them if he was part of the band, but honestly, I can't even recall what he said in response because it just didn't add up. At this point, I was done trying to convince myself that he wasn't completely full of it, and I was genuinely freaked out. Took me long enough to figure it out, right? But I was wiser now, so I began plotting my escape. I hoped that once he finished with the tour, we could step outside for just a minute, and then I could make my exit. I had definitely been in some shady situations before, but thankfully, nothing so severe that anyone tried to physically stop me when I walked away in a somewhat public area. I just felt uneasy about attempting to leave while still inside the house. I knew he was lying, but I had no clue how much worse things could get. I played along with his nonsense, pretending to believe him. When he offered me a beer, I politely declined, citing work in the morning. He accepted that and opened one for himself. Then he suggested heading down to the basement. From the top of the stairs, I could see that it was dark, creepy, and had tiny windows, so I refused. I asked if we could go back outside, but he insisted we wait until after the tour. I tried to argue against going into the basement, claiming I had a spider phobia and just didn't like basements in general. All lies, of course. His agitation grew at my hesitance, which made me realize that I needed to tread carefully. It would probably be best to let him take me down to the basement, and then, fingers crossed, we could head outside because I was at a loss for what else to do. To be honest, the basement was pretty unremarkable. Just a couch, a TV, and an elliptical machine, until something caught my eye that sent chills down my spine. The house seemed to have been built in the 1990s, or possibly the late 80s, at the very earliest. But there was a door that resembled the heavy foam-lined door to the cold storage room in my grandma's house. This type of door only opened from the outside, and it looked like a smaller version of the big metal doors you find on commercial walk-in fridges, making it feel really out of place in this home. I definitely wasn't about to go anywhere near that door, especially when he opened it and claimed it was their soundproof music studio. From a few meters away, I peeked inside, and it did look soundproof. It was roughly the size of a bedroom, and I spotted a few guitars and amplifiers along with mattress toppers on the walls. However, I didn't see any drums or recording equipment. He insisted I step inside for a closer look, standing by the door and gesturing for me to enter, which set off alarm bells in my mind. At that moment, I realized I could be in serious danger if I wasn't careful, so I quickly turned around and bolted up the stairs. He closed the door behind me and followed, asking what was wrong and acting as if I was being unreasonable for not wanting to check out his soundproof music studio. That's when it hit me. This situation was way sketchier than anything I had dealt with before, and I was starting to panic. My main goal became getting out of that house. Both the front and back doors were locked tight, so if I tried to make a run for it, he would likely catch me before I could get the locks open. The bathroom didn't have a window, and the house had a confusing layout that I wasn't familiar with. Plus, he was much bigger than me, tall and lanky, the type who can sprint even if they smoke a pack a day. I pretended to be okay with hanging out, hoping he would relax a bit. We made some small talk for a few minutes, and he cracked open another beer, which thankfully seemed to calm him down. Desperately, I brought up how beautiful it was outside again and suggested that we decided to sit in the yard while we waited. But he quickly shot down the idea and began to get restless. I mentioned that I was ready to leave, but I assured him I could stick around if I could just have a cigarette. He suggested we could smoke inside and pointed to a bowl filled with cigarette butts. We settled at the table and lit up some cigarettes. As he smoked, he started rolling a joint, which he lit as soon as he finished his cigarette. He offered me some, but I politely declined. He pressed me to try it, so I took the tiniest puff possible. Although I'm quite experienced with smoking, I exaggerated my coughing and claimed to be a beginner, saying that was more than enough for me. Luckily, he wasn't very good at detecting when someone was being dishonest. After we finished smoking, he asked if I wanted to watch a movie until his bandmates returned. I told him I was really eager to spend the day outside and suggested we take a walk or visit the park. He didn't seem to like those ideas at all. At this point, I was trying to maintain as much distance as I could between us, but he stayed close enough that I could smell the beer on his breath. He wrapped his arms around my waist, and I instinctively stepped back, redirecting the conversation by asking about the barbecue food, hoping to make him think I still believed what he was saying. He became angry again and firmly reminded me that his bandmates would be home any minute. My anxiety was skyrocketing at this point. I attempted to calm him down with some casual small talk, and then something unexpected happened that might have saved me. Simon went to the fridge for another beer and pulled out an empty box, which only fueled his anger further. In a moment of desperation, I suggested we grab more beer for the party since I was running out of ideas. I was terrified that suggesting we leave the house again would infuriate him even more, but I felt I had to give it a shot. Fortunately, his eyes brightened at the thought that I might actually want a drink with him, and he agreed. As we walked to the liquor store, I still didn't have a solid plan because I no longer felt safe just walking away from this unpredictable guy. It was a strangely empty suburb, but I felt an immense sense of relief to finally be out of that house. As I strolled with him toward the liquor store, I mentioned that I didn't need to go inside if he was just picking up some beer. However, he insisted that I had to join him. At that moment, I was so overwhelmed and frazzled that I decided to go along with him, hoping for a chance to escape. Once we entered the liquor store, he asked me what kind of beer I wanted. I reminded him that I had work the next day and didn't want to drink too much. He pressed me for a specific choice, so I blurted out the first brand that popped into my head. After he went to pay, the cashier turned out to be rather rude, which made me hesitate to ask for help. In hindsight, I probably should have, but panic took over, and I didn't. I hoped someone in the parking lot might come to my aid if I created a bit of a scene, but unfortunately, there was no one around. I deeply regretted not asking the cashier for assistance at that point, but I also recalled how my ex used to tell people I was crazy, making them dismiss me. The liquor store guy definitely seemed like the type who would fall for that, so maybe it was for the best that I kept quiet. Still, I had one last idea before resorting to running or screaming. There was a drugstore right across from the liquor store, so I told Simon I needed to buy a toothbrush or something, hinting that I might stay over. He eagerly agreed but tried to follow me inside. I told him that you couldn't bring beer into a drugstore. I wasn't even sure if that was true, but thankfully, this drunken jerk bought it and waited outside. Being as naive as I was, I thought I could just roam around the drugstore long enough for him to get the hint or become bored and leave. However, I must have wandered for at least half an hour, and he was still standing there staring through the window. This creep didn't even have his phone out, and every time I checked, he was just fixated on the window, searching for me. Felt completely alone in the city, with no one to reach out to for help. The police here typically don't take situations like mine very seriously, and the employees at the store seemed to be mostly high school kids, so I didn't want to involve them either. After spending so much time inside, I realized my options were quite limited. I was surprised that he didn't come in to check on me, as I thought maybe I could lose him among the aisles and sneak out if he did. Instead, I found myself lingering near the checkout area, waiting for a large group of friendly-looking customers to finish paying. Once they did, I quickly followed them outside and firmly told Simon to leave me alone and go home. I made sure to say it loud enough to suggest that I wouldn't hesitate to cause a scene if necessary. Simon glanced at the people getting into their cars who were now watching us, because I had nearly shouted at him, and then he simply turned around and walked away. It was oddly anticlimactic, but honestly, I was really relieved. I dashed towards the station, which thankfully was in the opposite direction of his house and the store, and after that day, I never heard from him again. When I got home, I noticed that his app profile had either been blocked or deleted. Years later, after I stopped pushing the memory aside, I genuinely regretted not reporting him or taking some action. It troubles me to think about whether he might have tried something similar with someone else, perhaps after ensuring his fridge was stocked first. At that moment, though, I just didn't believe anyone would take me seriously. I felt embarrassed about my choices and wanted to put the whole experience behind me. All I had was what seemed like a fake first name and a vague idea of where his house was, which probably wasn't sufficient information. I suppose I'll never know more than I do now, and maybe that's for the best. Regardless, I'm thankful I managed to escape that day, despite all the poor decisions I made. One night, I was driving home around 12:30 a.m., which was nothing out of the ordinary for me. This late-night drive was part of my weekly routine, so I wasn't scared or preoccupied with anything serious. It was winter, and the roads were fairly deserted, so I found myself driving between 90 and 120 km/h. After driving for about an hour, I approached a bridge where the air felt more misty due to the water below. I decided to ease off the gas, reducing my speed to around 38 km/h. That's when I spotted her, a woman clad entirely in white, standing alone by the side of the bridge. I'm not one to make reckless decisions in strange situations, so stopping wasn't even a thought. Yet out of nowhere, My car stalled unexpectedly. I was momentarily taken aback by this turn of events. It was then that I realized she was cradling a child in her arms. I can't quite explain what compelled me, but I rolled down my window and asked if she needed a ride or if she was all right. She didn't respond. Instead, she simply stood there, slowly lifting her hand to point toward the river below. That's when I made the mistake of glancing at the child. All I can say is that his face was an alarming shade of bright red. It's difficult to articulate, but it was definitely unsettling. After seeing that child, a wave of fear jolted me back to reality, and I regained control of myself. My mother's old advice echoed in my mind, and I instinctively followed it. I spat in that direction, then slammed my foot on the accelerator, speeding away as fast as I could. I didn't dare look back, not even once. To this day, I still struggle to comprehend what transpired that night. Why did my car stall? What prompted me to speak to her? Who was that woman? And what was the nature of the child in her arms? Or perhaps a better question would be, what were they? And what exactly was she indicating? Now let's be honest, don't we all crave a touch of romance even if it's just in our headphones? Well, Dipsea is an audio app designed for romance enthusiasts, featuring short, steamy stories that immerse you in the fantasies you've been longing for. Founded by women, Dipsea offers a collection of spicy audiobooks tailored for female listeners, boasting over 1,000 titles crafted by professional writers and top-notch narrators. If you're anything like me and tend to have trouble sleeping, you'll appreciate their sleep section. Personally, I found their ambient soundscapes like winter rain incredibly soothing, and I ended up drifting off to sleep listening to one that night. It's a delightful and user-friendly app that's easy to navigate. You can look up your preferred romance categories such as contemporary, historical, dark, sports, western, romantic, sapphic, and many more. New chapters are added every week, ensuring there's always something fresh for you to dive into. Currently, listeners of this show can enjoy an extended 30-day free trial. Just head over to dipseastories.com. Scared to start your complimentary trial? That's dipseastories.com. Scared for 30 days of complete access at no cost. Visit dipseastories.com. Scared today. Now let me share a bit about my childhood in Union, Maine, where I spent the first 14 years of my life in a lovely blue farmhouse featuring a spacious basement, a backyard, and a blueberry field. I often heard strange noises coming from the basement, and my mom was never keen on me going down there, either. I suppose my imagination got the better of me, so one day when my mom wasn't home, I decided to venture down with my dog for some comfort. I carefully descended the 13 stairs to the basement, my feet hitting the floor, while my dog followed closely behind me. At the bottom of the stairs, I had the option to go left or right. Turning left led to a small room that used to be my older brother's bedroom, while going right took me to the garage area where we worked on cars, along with a wood stove and boiler room. The walls were lined with firewood we used for heating. Remember wandering around barefoot until I accidentally stepped on a nail, causing me to scream in agony as I stumbled back upstairs trying to pull it out. When my mom returned home, she found me in a pool of blood. We bandaged my foot, and I was sent outside to play while she cleaned up the basement. A few days later, curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to explore the basement again, this time wearing shoes and bringing my dog along. As I made my way to the boiler room, I suddenly heard a faint sound, almost like a small moan. That's when my dog began to growl, his fur standing on end, mirroring my own anxiety. In a panic, I dashed back upstairs once more. For days, I was eager to uncover what lay beneath, but eventually, I gave up. For a period of time, one night I found myself lying in bed, teetering on the edge of sleep. You know that feeling when you're almost dozing off but suddenly get jolted awake? Well, that's exactly what happened to me. In my startled state, I accidentally kicked my dog and ended up tumbling onto the floor, completely immobilized. The only part of me that could move were my eyes, which began to scan the room, landing on the corner that always filled me with dread. In that shadowy corner stood a tall, dark figure. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. My body was drenched in sweat as this entity approached me, halting right beside my bed. Glancing at the clock, I saw it was 2:07 a.m. It felt like my body was just starting to wake up. When I checked the clock again, it read 7:02 a.m. I had been asleep the entire time. Naturally, I shared this experience with my mom, but no one took me seriously. I was desperate to uncover the identity of this mysterious being. A few weeks later, after returning home from school and finding my mom absent, I decided against doing my homework, because, let's face it, who wants to do that? Instead, I opted to play outside with my neighbor. We headed to the basement where things took a sinister turn. He brought along a Ouija board, and we started messing around with it at the table. Suddenly, a pen spun wildly and jabbed me in the stomach. He thought I did it intentionally, but when we both released the board, the lights began to flicker, and the board flipped upright all on its own. Panicking, he tossed it into the wood stove, but for some strange reason, it wouldn't catch fire. That's when we realized we needed to escape. As we bolted up the stairs, I felt a force push me down them, while he didn't stop until he reached the top. Eventually, I managed to scramble up the stairs and we dashed outside to wait for my mom to return. After that incident, things gradually settled down and returned to a semblance of normalcy. However, my dreams continued to haunt me, leading me to seek therapy. There's much more to this story that I'm eager to share in the future, so stay tuned, and thank you for listening. This all unfolded in Cocoa Beach, Florida, back in May. In 2021, after spending an hour or two admiring the sunset and reflecting on my life while watching the waves ebb and flow, darkness began to settle in. My gaze shifted to the stars, and that's when I noticed a peculiar light in the distance. It resembled a plane, but it was moving too swiftly for its altitude. It exhibited the typical traits of a UFO, darting around like a bee instead of gliding smoothly through the sky. Initially, I thought it might be a high-tech drone since there was a launch station nearby. However, that assumption quickly faded as it continued to hover above me without any clear path. I can't quite articulate the sensation, but it felt as if the light was aware of my presence. Once I focused completely on it, it veered towards the ocean, prompting me to sit up and peer over the water to keep observing. I recall that the moon was at least half full, casting enough light for me to see the clouds and anyone strolling along the beach, even though I was alone at that moment. I watched what I could only describe as a distant star-like light, slightly larger than the brightest star in the sky, buzzing around erratically in a seemingly aimless manner. Yet now it appeared to be putting on a show, flying in a chaotic fashion. It would dart off in one direction at incredible speed and then come to an abrupt halt. I also observed the clouds reacting to its movements, twisting and shifting in a DNA-like pattern. Around this time, things took a strange turn. This is where my perception of reality began to unravel. The light was positioned on the left side of the sky when, out of nowhere, it shot across horizontally to the right at about 10 times its previous speed. As it approached a small patch of clouds, I witnessed it teleporting 100 yards to its left, and then the same distance to its right, repeating this sequence 8 to 10 times while maintaining its trajectory. It seemed to jump from point to point rather than fly. After this flurry of movement, it came to a complete stop, leaving me in awe. For the first time in my life, I found myself wondering, did I really just see that? And just to emphasize the spectacle, it performed another astonishing maneuver. It feels like I'm experiencing the same situation all over again, almost as if it's a recurring nightmare. The sensation is genuinely painful for me. Suddenly, it darts back to the left side of the sky, zipping across and vanishing in an instant. Now I'm standing upright as my reality starts to unravel right before my eyes, and I'm struggling to comprehend what I'm witnessing and what's unfolding around me. A man departing from the beach begins to approach me, and I think to myself, perfect. Maybe someone else can see what I'm seeing. I manage to catch his attention, although he appears quite irritated by it, and I ask him, "Are you noticing that thing flying up there?" His reply is nonchalant. Yeah, it's pretty cool, huh? He then strolls off the beach without even glancing up at the sky while saying this. Great. So now I feel insane, and I must look crazy to this random dad, I think to myself. After this encounter, I'm unsure what happened to the light. I was too stunned, my mind was just in a state of confusion. I assume it must have shot off into space shortly after I spoke with the man, but that's when the humanoid encounter begins. I don't spot anyone else nearby who could have witnessed the light, so I start making my way toward the water. At this point on the beach, there's a ridge about 20 feet from the shoreline, leading down gradually to the water, which is about 5 feet below. As I stand at the top of the ridge, I notice two figures approaching from the left, positioned directly in front of the shoreline. Initially, I think they are just two people jogging side by side. However, as I focus on them, I realize I can't discern any body parts moving or any distinct features. I don't see arms or legs in motion, hair swaying, or sand being disturbed. Nothing. At all. I can make out the shape of a torso and perhaps some legs, but I'm seeing right through them into the ocean, as if they possess some sort of predator-like camouflage. They appear to be the same height, yet both shorter than the average human, moving in perfect harmony with one another, seeming more like they're floating rather than walking or running, even though they maintain a jogging pace. I still wonder if it's just my eyes playing tricks on me in the dim light, but it really isn't that dark. I decide to walk closer as they pass slowly in front of me, just in case they are merely joggers, not wanting to startle anyone by approaching them unexpectedly in the dark. But as I take a step, after taking a few steps forward, they both quickened their pace and disappeared from my view in just a matter of seconds. Yet again, there were no noticeable movements, sounds, or anything else. They simply sped away along the shoreline. Reflecting on the entire experience, I find it intriguing that I encountered these beings right after witnessing the light. I still entertain the idea that it could have been military technology, and those figures were merely cloaked individuals checking to see who witnessed the test flight. However, the sense of a mental connection between us leads me to believe it was more of a spiritual or extraterrestrial encounter. It felt as if they communicated a message like, "Hey, watch this," before completely blowing my mind with all the teleportation phenomena. I also experienced an overwhelming presence, or perhaps just sheer terror, after spotting those figures, which prompted me to leave immediately in my car. I've had numerous strange experiences, but most have been subjective, enough that I can't definitively claim they weren't hallucinations or something similar, since I was the only observer. However, this particular incident was also heard by my mother, and if you knew her, you'd realize there's no way she would just go along with something like that. We lived in a bungalow on a farm a few miles away from the nearest town. The closest buildings were the farmhouse further up a single-lane track and the landowner's house, which was across a field from us. The farmer was a solitary man in his late 40s, while the landowners were an elderly couple living alone. So it's highly unlikely that some random kid I knew would venture out in the middle of the night, somehow sneak into my home just to call my name, and then quietly exit without making a sound. My stepdad, who is a scientist, insists that this is the explanation, which frustrates me because it seems utterly ridiculous. He can be quite stubborn, too. At the time of the incident, I was around 14 years old, living with my mother and younger sister, who was 12. Her bedroom was located on the other side of the kitchen, separated by a hallway from mine. The kitchen door was closed, so it couldn't have been her, and besides, it didn't sound anything like her. My mother's room was diagonally across from mine, over the hallway. I think her door was slightly open, but my door was shut. This all happened about 10 to 15 minutes later. We've all been in bed when suddenly, right outside my door, a voice shouted. It was such an odd tone, desperate yet aggressive at the same time. Felt strangely familiar, but also completely unlike any voice I'd ever encountered. I was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't move at all. About half an hour passed, although it felt like just a moment before I called out to my mom asking, "Mom, did you call me?" She replied that she hadn't, but she had heard it too. That was the tipping point for me. I broke down in tears, overwhelmed by fear like never before. It's worth mentioning that when she responded, there was a clear difference in volume. I could easily distinguish her voice from whatever that other sound was because hers came through much quieter and muffled, given the distance between us. I realize this story contains a lot of seemingly random details about the house, but these are the specifics I've replayed in my mind, searching for any ordinary explanation. I can confidently say that what I experienced was a disembodied voice. Even though it terrified me initially, I find some comfort in it now. I'm usually quite skeptical even about my own experiences, but this is one thing I know for sure happened. It wasn't just in my imagination, and it remains inexplicable. I often ponder the idea that if a voice can suddenly emerge from nowhere, which seems impossible, then perhaps anything is achievable. This thought genuinely fills me with hope. Honestly, I'm not sure where to begin with this. Typically, I don't delve into these kinds of stories, but this one fascinates me. When I was 13, I had a whole group of friends, and we went camping. At a site near some woods, there were about 12 of us, and we built a hut there. There was also a small lake where we could fish, making it a really enjoyable spot. The previous year, we had already made some progress on our hut without any issues, and we would venture out at night with flashlights, having a great time. I should mention that there was always a guy who tried to prank us at night using a music box, sneaking away to play creepy sounds and such. The year before this incident, we discovered a section of the woods. We stumbled upon a camping area that appeared to be deserted. I can't say for certain, but that's the impression it gave off, and it definitely sent shivers down everyone's spine. Personally, I didn't find it eerie. Instead, I thought it was intriguing. The woods we were exploring were adjacent to an empty campsite, which made it exciting to discover new things. My friends and I, along with 5 others, were heading to our hut as usual. It was around 8 p.m. in winter, so darkness fell quickly. We were engaged in typical activities like gathering sticks, creating what we called a roof, and searching for sticks that resembled guns. After about an hour, we suddenly heard a terrifying noise. Initially, everyone was laughing because we assumed it was one of our friends playing a prank again. We even FaceTimed him to tell him to cut it out, but he claimed he was still at his tent. The chills running down our spines were intense, so I urged everyone to hush. It was quiet for over 30 seconds, and then, just 5 minutes later, we were startled by a bone-chilling screech that none of us had ever encountered before. It was definitely not human. Fear gripped us all, and we decided to move toward the abandoned section of the campsite. The campsite itself was quite expansive, but we lingered there for about 20 minutes, chatting and convincing ourselves it was nothing, until we began to hear the sound of bushes rustling, suggesting something large was nearby. We lived in an area where bears or any creatures that could make such noises were virtually non-existent. In hindsight, it might have been a deer, but at that moment, we were too frightened to consider it. We remained frozen in place, doing nothing, until after about 30 minutes we collectively decided to bolt back to safety. Upon returning, we vowed never to venture into the woods at night again. When we finally returned to our tents around 10:30 the next morning, we were shocked to find everything completely torn apart. This entire ordeal unfolded within a brief span of just 2 to 3 hours, although it felt longer since we came back in the morning. The 2 to 3 hours refers specifically to the time we experienced those unsettling sounds and sights, and to this day, it's challenging to come up with a logical explanation for it all. Earlier tonight, my girlfriend and I had a short yet profoundly disturbing encounter in the lobby of a historic hotel located in downtown Oklahoma City. The weather outside was bitterly cold and windy, and we had just returned from an OKC Thunder game, making our way back to the hotel. When we arrived at the hotel where my mother was staying, it was around 8:30 p.m. to set the scene. This establishment is housed in the historic First National Bank building and has been meticulously restored to showcase its former grandeur. The floors gleamed with polished marble, and the decor was lavish, reminiscent of a more opulent era. In the center of the lobby, a staircase led up to a lively upper level featuring a check-in desk, a restaurant, warm lighting, and the buzz of conversation. However, the atmosphere by the valet in the lobby felt strikingly different. It was cold, eerily quiet, and that's when I spotted him. Leaning against a pillar near the staircase was a man who seemed engrossed in his phone, holding it with both hands, as if he were texting. My initial glance was fleeting until the device slipped from his grasp and struck the marble floor with a sharp crack. Yet he remained motionless, his hands still poised as if he were still gripping the phone. Confused, I wondered if he had somehow fallen asleep while standing. My gaze flicked down to the phone on the ground and then back to his face, and that's when I realized he was staring right at me, his expression one of pure disgust. It wasn't the type of anger you might see from someone feeling wronged. It was something far more sinister, hollow and malevolent. His eyes blazed with a fury so intense that it sent chills racing down my spine. It was the kind of look that churns your stomach and makes you instinctively want to turn away, which is exactly what I did, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling as we waited for the elevator. When it finally arrived, curiosity got the best of me, and I glanced back toward the pillar. He was still there, still fixated on me, his gaze pressing down like a heavy weight. I quickly stepped into the elevator, relieved when the doors closed behind me, shutting out that disquieting scene. Once we reached my mother's room, I asked if she had noticed the man, but she hadn't. When I recounted what had happened, she dismissed it, suggesting he was probably on drugs. However, my girlfriend had seen him too. While she didn't witness the phone drop, she caught that same look of utter disgust aimed at us. After a few minutes, we decided to head back to our car. As the elevator doors slid open, my heart raced. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't resist. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. He was still there watching. As I was staring, my girlfriend later confirmed it. She had also locked eyes with him. We both noticed that same look of disdain as we exited the lobby while walking down the sidewalk. I couldn't help but take one last look through the glass doors. At that moment, he had turned to face us completely, his gaze fixated on mine. It felt like he was tracking us as we stepped out into the night. His expression was chilling, almost psychopathic. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it felt fundamentally wrong. There was something about it that instinctively screamed danger. The second we rounded the corner, we broke into a sprint, rushing to our car and locking the doors the instant we got inside. Fortunately, he didn't follow us. Yet even hours later, the image of that face still haunts me, and I know I'll never forget it. So what do you all think was happening? Was it drugs, mental illness, or something more sinister? There's this unsettling presence in my family's home that's been bothering us for about 2 or 3 years now. It all began a few years ago when I was trying to go to sleep. Whenever I lay down, I would see hands emerging from the bedroom doorway, almost as if they were trying to climb in. This always happened out of the corner of my eye. I shared this experience with my family, and while they believed me, they hadn't seen anything themselves. So they were understandably skeptical about what I was describing. Eventually, my brother started seeing the same thing by the doorway, but this time, it appeared as a head. I began to see it too, and we affectionately dubbed it the head. Later, I stumbled upon an urban legend that parents tell their kids to encourage them to sleep called El Coco. As bizarre as it sounds, El Coco is a monster with enormous bat-like ears that roams around at night, listening for children who are still awake, and he supposedly eats them. When I looked up the meaning, I found that it loosely translates to the head. I found it eerie that we were calling this entity the head, and there was already a legend with the same name. What's even stranger is that soon after, my mom claimed to have seen it too. She works at a care home next to our house, and one day while she was in the dining room, she noticed a cutout nearby. As she was about to step out of the room, she noticed a head peeking through the cutout. For just a brief moment, she thought it belonged to one of the residents, but it quickly vanished from view, as it always does. Curious, she approached to see if anyone was there, but naturally there was no one. I think my dad has encountered it too, although I can't recall the details of his story, so I won't elaborate on that. A month or two ago, it either stopped appearing or we simply stopped noticing it because we hadn't seen it again. However, just a few days ago, my other brother, who I haven't mentioned yet, was hanging out with the first brother in that same bedroom while I was in the living room. The second brother caught a glimpse of something in the doorway out of the corner of his eye and asked the first brother if I was there. Typically, the head appears high above the doorway, but this time it was lower down. I'm not sure if it was the same entity, but it seems like it's back. I'm really curious about what this thing is. I know it sounds far-fetched, but whether you believe me or not, I'm wondering if you've heard any myths or legends about something similar, or if you've had an experience like this yourself. It doesn't seem like a ghost to me, given how it tries to conceal itself, almost as if fear's being discovered. From what I understand about ghosts, they can just vanish at will. Regardless, if you have any insights to share, I would be incredibly grateful. When I was around 17, my mother and I moved into a large house owned by her boss. It had at least 5 bedrooms, 6 if you counted the study. There were plenty of warning signs, but we were in a tough spot and the rent was affordable. On moving day, my mother's antique grandfather clock toppled over in the U-Haul. It had a decorative spike on top that bent during the fall. It was made of brass or some copper-like metal, and a noticeable crease formed where it had been damaged. I tried to fix it, but I was afraid of breaking it completely. We managed to get it into the house and continued unpacking, and the next day, to our surprise, the spike stood straight up with no trace of the crease whatsoever. That was definitely strange. Our first night there was filled with constant bangs and thuds, making it sound like I was sprinting through the hallways, and our little dog, an AED terrier, was barking and going wild. I assumed it was just the old house settling or perhaps a loose shutter banging against the window. However, I soon discovered that the shutters were purely decorative and securely attached to the exterior of the house. After that initial noise, the house fell silent, but the sounds of footsteps in the halls persisted for quite some time. A couple of months later, I began experiencing unsettling dreams. Typically, I dream in third person, shifting perspectives among different characters, and I rarely see myself in my dreams. But these nightmares were different. They were in first person, placing me right in my bed with a man standing near the. There were no outlets in the room for a lamp, and the only source of light was a pull cord by the door. This was before I owned a cell phone, so I never thought to grab a flashlight. Since I couldn't turn on the light, I could barely make out the figure as he lingered by the door. Eventually, I would drift into the dream and then it would come to an end. I had this nightmare frequently, though not every night or even weekly, but it occurred often enough to be bothersome. I kept quiet about it because, honestly, what kind of conversation would that spark? Then, one night, everything shifted. Instead of being by the door, the man was now right next to my bed, seemingly gazing down at me. The moonlight illuminated him just enough for me to see his features. He was an older man dressed in a black and gray striped pinstripe suit, complete with a small bowler hat. His smile stretched across his face, revealing sharp, glistening teeth. He said, "Don't worry, it won't hurt. I'll eat you while you're asleep." The next thing I knew, morning had arrived. I made up some excuses and told my mom I wanted to switch rooms to be closer to the bathroom. I figured if the man was real, he was somehow connected to that bedroom, which had once been the master's suite. Of course, I didn't mention the dream at all. Things went smoothly in the new room, and I didn't have any more nightmares. However, there were still plenty of late-night footsteps that led to nowhere. At this point, I started keeping a flashlight by my side. Additionally, I heard a man yelling several times throughout the house, loud enough to drown out the TV and send the dog into a frenzy, but again, that wasn't too unusual. It was a frightening experience when I suddenly woke up in sheer terror and dashed out of my room. However, halfway to the kitchen, I paused, realizing that nothing was actually pursuing me. It was definitely an unusual night. Things took a turn for the worse on Christmas. We had family visiting and were unwrapping gifts in the living room, where a couch faced the large sliding double doors leading to the parlor. Those doors were shut tight. Suddenly, my mom glanced at the couch and screamed, causing all of us to jump and try to see what she was looking at. But there was nothing there. She quickly apologized and left the room in a hurry. Later on, I spoke with her about it, and she admitted she didn't want to discuss it at first. Eventually, she revealed that she had seen an older man standing behind the couch, dressed in a suit with gray or black pinstripes and wearing a small, round hat. Naturally, I was startled by this revelation and asked if she had encountered him before, to which she replied no. I then shared my dream with her, and we both felt a wave of unease. That night, she decided to move her room closer to the bathroom. After that incident, we experienced other strange occurrences in that house, but we never saw the man again. Eventually, we moved out, and several others came and went from that house, none lasting more than a year. It has remained vacant for quite some time now. In 2022, my brother and I left our mom's place and got our own apartment, a single-wide trailer located about 10 minutes away from her home. This was my first experience living independently, and while the trailer wasn't anything extravagant, it was just your average trailer. The door does creak loudly when it opens and closes, so you can always tell when someone is coming or going. My brother worked at a pest control company, which meant his hours were unpredictable. Sometimes he'd be home early, and other times he'd be out late. This left me responsible for making sure he had meals, which I didn't mind because I genuinely enjoy cooking. There's something soothing about it for me. One particular night, my brother was working late, so I prepared dinner as usual. Chicken wings accompanied by onion rings and potato wedges. I managed to finish everything before he even arrived home. Now that I'm home, I typically don't eat right after I cook. It's just something I've always done, and I'm not quite sure why, but it's what I enjoy. On this particular day, I decided to step outside for a smoke, so I went out to the back porch to light up my cigarette. There's a window from which I can see into the kitchen, but the blinds were drawn. I did leave the kitchen light on. While I was smoking, I heard the loud sound of the storm door slamming shut, followed by footsteps inside. Curious, I glanced toward the window and noticed a shadow moving through the kitchen. Not thinking much of it, I assumed it was my brother. After finishing my cigarette, I went back inside to let him know that dinner was ready and waiting in the oven. However, I quickly realized that his bedroom door was still closed and the light was off. He usually keeps it open when he gets home, or if he's on the phone, the light would be on. So, I peeked in, but he wasn't there. I walked through the trailer towards the bathroom in my room, but he was nowhere to be found. When I opened the front door, I saw that his truck wasn't even in the driveway. I wasn't really scared, just more puzzled. I felt a bit uneasy, though, knowing I had heard the storm door and seen someone or something pass by the window. I searched the entire place again, hoping to avoid running into an intruder, but there was nothing. I was completely alone. About 30 minutes later, my brother arrived home, and as I sat in the living room, he noticed that I looked confused. He asked me what was wrong, and I explained everything that had happened. He then shared that he sometimes sees a shadow in the trailer too, but he always thought it was me until he realized I was actually in bed snoring loudly. We both have no idea who or what it could be. A few weeks later, while I was at home taking care of my niece, I set up some small bags of chips on the counter, organized by brand, so she could grab one whenever she wanted a snack. She happened to be napping, so I took the opportunity to tidy up a bit. The counter was directly behind me, perpendicular to where I was standing while washing dishes. Suddenly, I heard a faint crumpling sound and turned around, expecting to see my niece with a bag of chips. Instead, I found a bag lying on the floor about 3 feet away from the counter. She's still resting in the same spot where I left her, exactly as I last saw her. Everything seems undisturbed, yet I feel a bit anxious and puzzled. I didn't accidentally bump into them. They were quite far away. The fans weren't running, and all the doors and windows were closed, so there was no air movement or drafts. The chips on the counter weren't scattered or thrown around either. They were neatly arranged. There's a 1.5 feet of countertop. space between the chips and the edge, making it impossible for them to have fallen off, let alone ended up 3 feet away in the middle of the floor. We've heard stories from previous tenants and the landlord about an elderly woman who got sick and passed away here years ago. Now I'm wondering if it could be her spirit. I moved out the following year because my brother had started dating a girl who became pregnant. She needed a place to stay due to her own circumstances, and I was asked to leave, which I didn't appreciate, but eventually accepted. They would sometimes visit and share spooky experiences that continued to occur in that trailer. They both reported seeing shadows and hearing footsteps inside when they were outside. One of them would hear voices and giggling while the other wasn't home. Occasionally, kitchen cabinets would be found open, and they'd wake up to find things missing, only to discover them in different spots around the house. Initially, she thought it was just her pregnancy brain playing tricks on her until one night, while they were watching TV on the couch. My brother always placed his work boots by the front door, and suddenly they heard a scuffing noise. They muted the TV, and one of his boots flew into view, hitting the wall near the TV. They both jumped, turned off the TV, and ran to their bedroom to hide. The next morning, as he was leaving for work, he noticed that same boot was back by the toe door, but not in its usual spot. It looked as if something had thrown it back toward the door. After that incident, my brother and sister-in-law felt uneasy in the trailer and hesitated to invite friends over, fearing they might seem crazy or that something strange might happen. They finally moved out in August 2024 and were relieved to leave that unsettling place behind. As for me, I love hiking and geocaching. During my leisure time, I sought refuge from the rising number of attacks in the area by steering clear of Grand. Instead, I stumbled upon a charming little park where I could hide my geocaching treasures. It was situated far enough from Grand M that I felt secure venturing out alone with my pocket knife in hand. About an hour into my exploration, I found myself straying from the main path while searching for a geocache. The day was exceptionally calm and quiet. Typically, you would hear people strolling, birds chirping, and the gentle waves of Lake Michigan. However, on this particular day, an unsettling silence enveloped the park, making me feel as though I was being observed. As I stood up to survey my surroundings, I locked eyes with a man who was watching me from the main trail. Once our gazes met, he began walking toward me, and an instinctive urge to flee washed over me. Being a woman in her late 20s alone in the woods with a stranger keeping tabs on me was far from ideal. I started making my way back to the main trail, determined to put some distance between us. Unfortunately, he obstructed my path and attempted to engage me in conversation. I tried to keep moving, but he continued to block the trail, making it difficult to navigate around him due to the surrounding thorns and mud. The man initiated a conversation, asking if I was hunting for mushrooms or had misplaced something. I explained that I was geocaching but needed to return to my car. In response, he flashed a creepy smile and persisted in preventing me from reaching my vehicle. Eventually, I managed to end our bizarre exchange by opting for an alternate route since he wouldn't let me pass. As I walked away, I glanced back to see him still fixated on me, watching me retreat further. Once I finally reached the main trail, I paused briefly to scan the area for any sign of the man, but he was nowhere to be found. Continuing towards my car, I could now see the parking lot in the distance just a quarter-mile away. That's when the man re-emerged from a small side trail and began following me. As I quickened my pace, his footsteps grew louder and faster. Behind me, I glanced over my shoulder once more, and there he was. Now I found myself about 200 feet away from the man, so I quickened my pace to keep an eye on him again. At this point, he was only 100 feet behind me, and it became clear that he was trying to close the gap. Just then, my phone began to ring. It was my best friend calling me on FaceTime. As I answered, I raised my phone as if to show my friend the park I had discovered. The moment the man noticed I was on the phone, his speed decreased immediately. I finally reached the parking lot and hopped into my car, but I saw that the man was still hanging around until I was completely inside. After that, he quietly slipped away towards another trail and disappeared from view. He appeared to be in his late 20s or early 30s, with an average build, dark hair, and striking green eyes. I couldn't help but wonder if anyone else had encountered strange men in this area. I live in southwest Michigan, roughly an hour from Grand Mare State Park, which has seen 2 recent attacks just 6 months apart. One incident involved a woman who was knocked unconscious and woke up hours later to find herself injured. The other case also involved a woman who was attacked while walking her dog. Both women provided descriptions to the local police, and their accounts shared many similarities. These attacks occurred in April and September of the same year, 2024, and both incidents bore a striking resemblance to what happened to me. In the summer of 1989, I got the chance to leave the reservations and spend the entire summer with my half-brother, same dad, different moms, in Kentucky. I was 12 and he was 14 at the time. His stepdad was pretty cool and incredibly smart. He worked as a nuclear physicist and always had insightful answers, especially regarding the natural world. My step-grandma was a nurse who worked long shifts at 2 different hospitals. Poor lady not only worked around 16 hours a day, but also came home to clean and prepare large meals for everyone. Honestly, I felt really sorry for her. On the reservations, my family lived close to one another, including my brother's family. Sometimes we would go over to help his grandma with cooking and cleaning. We even helped gather firewood for her since she often did that too, and we would sometimes stay until she finished her tasks. After heading out for work, we would stroll back home through the fields. The atmosphere was quite different in rural Kentucky. The nights were much darker and eerily quiet. While I could have been on the reservation, there was always some movement around there. Sure, you could venture further out and find a similar level of darkness and silence on the res, but I think you understand what I mean. Occasionally, the stillness in Kentucky would be interrupted by a car passing on the highway, or the distant rumble of a freight train. One day, my brother's stepdad decided to get cable TV, including a movie channel, which sparked our plans to binge-watch as many films as we could that Friday night with Grandma. We made sure to let her know we wouldn't be visiting that day. My brother even invited his friend over for a sleepover, and earlier, we had gone into town to stock up on snacks: pizza, potato chips, black cherry soda, strawberry cola, lemon-lime sodas, and plenty of candy. If I recall correctly, Escape from New York was set to air that night, so we were pretty pumped. Once Johnny Carson wrapped up, the adults began heading to bed. Just as we settled in, there was a loud knock at the door. It was my brother's step-uncle, Bill, his stepdad's brother, who demanded to speak with him. We asked if everything was all right, but he looked terrified and waved us off. My brother's stepdad came out to talk, and Uncle Bill insisted they needed to discuss something about their mom. They stepped outside and we all strained to listen, but they ended up taking a walk. A few moments later, my brother's stepdad returned, dressed and looking somewhat incredulous, saying he would be back soon. Now, here's what we learned about the situation. That night, Grandma was going to work as usual around 9 p.m. She mentioned that she had driven a few miles down a rural road where traffic was scarce, especially at night. Suddenly, a bright, blinding white light illuminated her car. She described it as intense and hot, causing her vehicle to stall. The light hovered about 50 feet above her without making a sound. Paralyzed with fear, she remained there until it vanished, approximately 10 minutes later, after which she was finally able to restart her car. She returned home and mentioned that she attempted to reach out to her son, who is my brother's stepdad, but the line was disconnected. Fortunately, she managed to contact her other son, Bill. For the next few months, Bill and my brother's stepdad alternated driving her to work until she overcame her anxiety. Even after that, she consistently chose a different route for her commute. Strangely enough, she also recounted an encounter a few days later with 2 men in black ties who approached her. They claimed to be government officials, displayed badges, and bombarded her with questions, which profoundly impacted her demeanor. She transformed from being warm and approachable to becoming impatient and curt, even with family. However, years later, she completely dismissed those events, denying ever seeing or speaking to anyone. My brother's stepdad suspected it was related to something military and believed she had been threatened to remain silent about it. Everyone encouraged her to seek therapy, and I always thought her behavior stemmed from feeling violated and fearing disbelief from others. Not long after, perhaps a year later, shadowy figures began appearing around her house and my brother's, where there had previously been no signs of paranormal activity. That incident marked the last time I was permitted to visit their home. When I got back, we performed a cleansing ritual, but my dad wasn't interested in such practices, so he didn't participate. He would only remark that he sensed some negative energy lingering there, and that was the extent of his involvement. I grew up in an old house in the UK, which is my family's home, a 4-story terrace over 250 years old, located on a bustling street. Originally a manor house with extensive grounds, it was divided into 3 terrace homes, with additional ones constructed nearby in the late 1890s to early 1900s. The layout included 2 cellar rooms, 2 living rooms on the ground floor, and a kitchen. The first floor housed the bathroom, my parents' bedroom, and my brother's room, while the second floor was my bedroom or living space. I have had various experiences there since childhood that I might share later, but for now, I'll focus on incidents that occurred in my family home when I was between 15 and 16 years old, extending into my early 20s. One Saturday afternoon when I was around 15 or 16, I was in my bedroom reading, while living with my parents and my younger brother, who is 2 years younger than me. When I was younger, my dog and I were hanging out without any music or TV on that day. I could hear the faint sounds of traffic outside. At one point, I noticed someone coming in downstairs. I heard the door open and close along with the sound of keys jingling. My mom called up to me, asking me to come downstairs because she and Dad needed to discuss something important with me. This struck me as odd since she usually just shared whatever news she had from where she was. I asked her why I needed to come down, but she replied in a slightly annoyed tone, telling me to just come down. This made me think it must be serious, or that I might have done something wrong. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I felt confused because I couldn't find them anywhere. I called out hello in case they had gone into the cellar, which would also be unusual, but there was no answer. I started to wonder if I was imagining things and turned to head back upstairs when my brother shouted from his room, asking what Mom wanted since it was strange for her to call me down like that. I responded, asking him if he had heard her too, assuming he did. It felt odd that he had heard her, but I was certain no one was around, making me second-guess myself. However, he didn't reply, so I went to check on him. When I opened his door, I found that he wasn't there either. At that moment, I got a strange chill and goosebumps, feeling quite spooked. I quickly left his room and headed back downstairs, trying to piece together what had just happened. Just as I returned downstairs, my mom walked in with the dog. She had taken him for a walk. I asked her what was going on and where she had been. She looked puzzled and told me she had been out for about an hour and hadn't returned at any point. She explained that my dad was at work since 8 a.m. and wouldn't be back for a few hours, and my brother was supposedly at a friend's house. Later, when I was 20, I worked at a sort of convenience store that closed at 10 p.m. After closing, cashing up, and cleaning, I would typically leave around. At around 10:30, I arrived home, expecting to be there by 11, still living with my parents. During this time, my mom called me at 10:10 p.m., asking where I was. I was a bit puzzled and explained that I was still at work, locking up for the night. She then informed me that I had actually come home about 15 minutes earlier. Both she and my dad were in the front living room and heard me enter. To give you some background, we typically use the back door to come and go, and our house had 2 living rooms, one in the back and one in the front. My parents were in the front room, which was separated from the other by the stairs. Mom mentioned that they heard me come in and call out, hello, which was our usual greeting when anyone returned home. They responded with their own hellos and asked why I was back so early. In a light-hearted manner, I jokingly said, "So you're ignoring me?" They then heard me walk upstairs while chatting on the phone with someone. My dad went upstairs to check on me, curious about my early return and wanting to ensure everything was all right. However, he noticed that my light was off and it was eerily quiet, prompting him to head back down. They tried calling me only to discover that I hadn't been home at all. My dad hurried upstairs to make sure no one had broken in, but there was no sign of anyone around. On another occasion, when I was about 20, my parents were relaxing in the living room late at night, around 2 a.m., when they heard my brother practicing his guitar in his room. This wasn't out of the ordinary since he often played for hours, and they enjoyed listening to his faint melodies. Suddenly, they both remembered at the same moment that he was actually away at university, living in student housing 200 miles away, and had taken his guitars with him. When I was about 22, my best friend came over for a visit on a Friday night. I had been feeling pretty good, so she decided to drop by to hang out, listen to music, and chat. My parents were out at an event that evening, and it was mid-January. While my friend went upstairs to use the bathroom next to my brother's room, she came back downstairs and said, "Oh, your brother just called for you. He must have thought I was you when I walked upstairs." However, my brother was still at university, leaving us completely alone in the house. I inquired if she was sure about hearing him, and she insisted firmly that she had. She was so convinced that she believed I was just trying to scare her for fun. She was aware of the previous incidents which had unsettled her. I reassured her that he wasn't there and was actually at university, but she didn't buy it. In fact, she insisted we go upstairs to find out what he wanted. She was completely convinced she had just heard him. So I called out, but naturally, there was no reply. She suggested he might not have heard me, so I invited her to join me upstairs to show her he wasn't home. She confidently followed, still thinking I was joking. When we reached his room, I opened the door to find the light off and his belongings missing. Clearly, he wasn't there. Her face changed color, and she became visibly shaken after that. Before I continue, I want to mention that my job has significantly altered my view on the paranormal. For context, I work at a vintage store that specializes in antique Western American artifacts. The shop is situated in an affluent area where wealthy individuals purchase items in bulk to furnish their vacation homes. This results in a constant influx of sourced items coming in and out of the store. While I'm not involved in sourcing these items, I primarily sell them and assist in managing the store. However, it's evident that most, if not all, of these items carry some sort of energy with them, sometimes not a positive one. Within 3 months of working there, I realized the place was haunted, and it seemed like the resident spirits had taken a liking to me. With the constant movement of items, various energies and events would manifest and then fade away. Things were a bit strange from the start, but I attributed it to the age of the building. One morning, while opening the store alone during the dead of winter, everything outside was dark and snow-covered. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt an intense chill. It seemed like the heater had failed overnight. I went to turn it on, only to find it functioning perfectly. Yet the warmth it produced quickly faded after just a few feet. I shrugged it off and switched on the main floor lights before heading downstairs, where it was pitch black. This area housed most of our vintage items. Before I could switch on the lights, our music blared at full volume. The catch is that the music isn't set to play automatically. I manage it directly from my phone, and I hadn't activated the system yet. I was alone in the building and the surrounding area, so there was no way anyone else could have turned it on from their device. After calming down from the initial shock, I flipped the lights on and noticed that all the cushions had been tossed off our large vintage leather couch. It struck me as odd, but I tried to rationalize it by thinking that maintenance must have come in during the night to fix something. I tidied up the mess and headed upstairs again, only to find that all the lights I had just turned on were now off again. The switches were flipped down once more, not just the power. I brushed it off and turned them back on, then stepped outside to unlock the front door and switch on our open sign. That's when everything hit me. A display of locally made chapstick was suddenly knocked off the shelf, as if someone had forcefully pushed it off right in front of me. To clarify, it didn't simply fall. The shelf remained steady while it was shoved off, around 50 to 100 chapsticks scattered everywhere, and the acrylic case shattered into pieces. At that moment, the music system blared loudly again, leaving me completely stunned. Then everything fell silent, almost as if it or they wanted me to finally take notice. Just seconds later, the computer screen lit up, as if urging me to get to work. I think I stood there frozen for a good 10 minutes, unsure of what to do next. On another occasion, which happened about 4 months ago, our main vintage collector brought in some old mirrors he had sourced from various places and created a wall of them along the staircase. When I returned from vacation, I felt a bit uneasy, because I believe mirrors carry negative energy, especially those previously owned by others. However, it was just a regular day at work, helping customers and logging inventory. One of my coworkers was with me, and we were chatting casually about life. Eventually, she went downstairs to assist a customer in finding the price of a vintage fur coat and some artwork. I think it was around that time when the customers, as the daughter ascends the stairs, she passes by a mirrored wall and suddenly lets out a scream. Being the responsible adult, I rush towards the sound to see what's going on. The girl is in distress, insisting that she spotted a shadowy figure in the mirror. Her mother tries to soothe her, reassuring her that it was merely a shadow. I take a moment to investigate but find nothing unusual, just the usual unsettling feeling I get when passing those mirrors. We assist the woman, and she eventually leaves with her belongings. A few hours later, another customer comes in looking to purchase a coat rack located near the mirrors. While I'm busy using a drill to detach the coat rack, my coworker, who is holding the other end, suddenly goes pale. She's fixated on the mirrors, unable to tear her gaze away. I notice her do a double take and continue staring, which raises my concern. Once I finish helping the customer, I return to my coworker, who is still entranced by the mirrors. I shake her out of her daze, but she struggles to speak. It's only when she calls my name that I glance back at the mirrors and spot the same shifting figure, a form that morphs into various shapes, some feminine and others masculine, lacking a distinct face but possessing recognizable features. By now, I'm somewhat accustomed to these occurrences, so I pull her upstairs and try to brush it off for the rest of the day. However, throughout the day, several customers mention seeing strange things in that same mirror. One girl even got sick and vomited in the bathroom after claiming she felt nauseous while walking downstairs. When I returned from my shift the following week, the coat rack was gone. My coworker informed me that it hadn't sold, but another employee discovered it cracked one day. I have no idea what happened to it or where it ended up, but the other mirrors remain intact. The younger employees seem to experience odd happenings as well, though not to the extent I do. The older staff members don't report as many incidents, but they acknowledge that strange things occur here. We also have some seemingly friendly or mischievous resident spirits, if you can call them that. They enjoy flicking light switches on and off, making knocks that can't be attributed to the building itself, playing with the temperature and rearranging items on shelves. Occasionally, they create messes and play pranks, like throwing pillows off couches or tossing around stuffed animals. At night, things get rearranged and noises are made to startle people, and sometimes the music changes or the volume fluctuates. Generally, the occurrences here are harmless, not to mention that they enjoy tampering with our security cameras as well. Despite having the cameras and electrical systems checked countless times, everything seems to function properly. However, recordings frequently stop and cut out unexpectedly. On another occasion, as I was nearing the end of my shift, which involved tidying up and preparing the store for the next day's employees, I took some time to clean our vintage toy section. While organizing the rack of vintage Levi jeans, I heard a loud noise and went to check it out, assuming something had fallen over. Kids often place items back on shelves in unstable ways, causing things to topple over regularly. Not always due to any unusual activity, which is what I'm getting at. As I approached the toy corner, I noticed a toy train that had been knocked over but was still standing upright, which struck me as odd. This train doesn't operate on batteries or anything. It's quite old. To my astonishment, I watched it begin to move slowly from the corner and into the next aisle. Once again, it was merely a model train. No strings, no batteries, no track, nothing. After about 6 feet of movement, it came to a halt. After my initial shock, I decided to leave it there, letting whatever was moving it do its thing. I hesitantly ignored it and returned to my cleaning routine. There were no further sounds or movements, and just before closing up, I placed the train back on the shelf. On another occasion, I sold a customer an old turquoise Native American ring that was on sale, so it was non-returnable. A week later, she called, pleading for a return. She drove an hour back to the store, claiming she no longer wanted the ring. I thought to myself that someone must regret their purchase, which is understandable. However, she then explained that strange things had been happening in her home since acquiring it. Her cats were acting strangely, odd noises were echoing through the house, and doors were shutting by themselves. Although our policy didn't allow returns, we managed to work something out in the end. She appeared genuinely frantic. Sometimes in retail, you suspect someone might be fabricating a story to get their money back, but she truly seemed frightened. Based on my own experiences at work, I believed her without hesitation. Fortunately, nothing particularly strange occurred after we retrieved the ring. A little while later, it was purchased by a collector, and after that, we didn't hear anything more about it. It was definitely an unusual situation. Now, this tale isn't mine. It actually belongs to a friend of mine who was visiting at the time. She came to see me at work and wanted to try on some vintage clothes. So she headed into the dressing room to give them a go. While she was doing that, I stepped into the next room to show a customer where the bathroom was. When I returned, my friend looked quite startled to see me walk back into the main shop area. She glanced behind the counter and then back at me, looking a bit puzzled. I could tell she was trying to process something. She asked, "Weren't you just in the back room?" I was confused because I hadn't been there, and my coworker had left early. My friend is very practical. She believes in seeing things to believe them. Then she explained that the door to the back room, which customers could partially see, was halfway closed. She mentioned that she saw a shadow that matched my height and size making noise and moving around back there. She thought I was rummaging for items and even believed she heard me respond with an aha at one point. Keep in mind, no one else was in that area, and no other customers had come in during that time. When I went to check, whatever figure had been there was completely gone. Everything seemed normal, but she was utterly convinced I had been back there. These are just a few of the experiences from that place, and as I mentioned, working there has really shifted my perspective on things permanently. I don't think I'll ever be the same after my time there. This incident took place a couple of years ago, but I often reflect on it and wonder what that person's true intentions were. So, a few years back, probably in 2018, I found myself outside my mom's house around midnight. The neighborhood was dark, quiet, and pretty calm. I was leaning against my car, smoking and enjoying some music when I noticed someone walking up the street toward me. There was nothing alarming about it, but as she got closer, I saw that she was a cute woman in her mid-30s. She spotted me smoking and asked if I had a cigarette. She was friendly enough, but I told her I didn't have one. We ended up having a pleasant little chat. A young man envisions a charming woman approaching him, seemingly in search of something. It's all a bit whimsical at this stage, perhaps just a fanciful notion. During their brief conversation, which lasted about a minute, she interrupts to take a phone call. She speaks to her husband, or so I assume. I can't quite recall how I figured that out, but I believe she mentioned him earlier in our chat. This memory is somewhat hazy, but what happened next sent shivers down my spine. On the call, she quietly said, "Hi, honey. Oh my goodness, I think I found one." Her excitement was palpable, yet it carried an unsettling undertone that I can't quite articulate. It raised immediate red flags for me. Plus, I was puzzled by what she meant when she said she found something, especially since I had already told her I didn't have a cigarette. She was just wandering around the streets with her husband, searching for something. What could that possibly imply? Feeling uneasy, I turned away and went back inside, locking the door behind me. Even now, I'm unsure what to make of that encounter. What could she have been referring to? The best-case scenario might be that she was interested in a threesome with her husband, which isn't my thing at all. But the worst-case scenario could involve them planning something sinister against me. What do you think was really going on? Did I overreact, or was it a wise decision to be cautious? When I was about 3 years old, I'm 41 now, my family, including my mom, stepdad, and older sister, moved into a rental house in a lovely neighborhood in our small town. It was a spacious 3-bedroom, 2-bath home, much larger than where we had lived before. Despite finally having my own room, my sister and I chose to continue sharing a bedroom and a bed. We both felt a bit out of sorts in the new place, but my mom thought we were simply used to sharing a room for so long that we'd eventually adapt. This particular incident occurred when I was between 4 and 5 years old, while my sister was around 8. Our room was arranged with our bed tucked into a corner against the wall, where my sister slept. I was nestled against the wall on the inside, while I took my rest on the outside. An oscillating fan was positioned against the wall, directing its breeze toward our feet. Just beyond our door lay the hallway, with the bathroom situated directly across from it. One night, my sister stirred awake to head to the bathroom, and, for some inexplicable reason, I felt compelled to awaken and glance down by my feet. There, at the foot of the bed nearest to me, stood a dark silhouette that resembled my sister. The figure was so shadowy that I couldn't discern any facial features. It was merely an ominous void standing motionless. I could see the fan whirring behind her, yet the strands of her hair remained completely still, unaffected by the airflow. I called out her name but received no reply. I repeated her name several times, but there was still no answer or movement. When I peered into the hallway, I noticed the bathroom door was shut and the light inside was illuminated. As soon as the bathroom door swung open, the shadow vanished, and my sister entered the room. I remember feeling utterly terrified and bursting into tears. My sister came over to check on me, and eventually, I must have drifted off to sleep. Even at such a young age, the memory of that experience lingered with me well into the following day, leaving a lasting impression. Fast forward to when I was 9.5 years old. This incident occurred about 15 years ago. It was during summer vacation, around noon, and I had just finished showering, wrapped in a towel and still dripping wet. Feeling cheerful like a good little boy, I stepped into my bedroom, which I shared with my parents. I began sorting through my clothes, and I was alone in the room. Almost immediately upon entering, I sensed a strange vibration beneath my feet. As I rummaged through my clothes, I realized the source of the vibration seemed to be coming from behind me, near my parents' bed. It pulsated in a cyclical manner, growing stronger each time it returned. I tried to brush it off and enjoy my day, but eventually it became impossible to ignore. After putting on my shorts and holding a t-shirt in my hand, I turned around to investigate what was happening. To my surprise, I found my parents' bed shaking, for no apparent reason, and it appeared to originate from underneath. The tremors intensified to the point where, as the bed struck the ground, other objects began to tremble, and then, quite suddenly, everything went still again. Right in front of me, I noticed a strange creature emerging from beneath the bed, just a meter or two away. It was entirely black, darker than anything I had ever encountered before. In fact, it was so shadowy that distinguishing its features was nearly impossible. It resembled a quirky 2D figure, but definitely had 2 legs, a torso, 2 arms, and a head. At that moment, it seemed unaware of my presence as I watched it from across the room. The creature appeared to be about my size, and paused for a brief moment, which I initially interpreted as it brushing something off its shoulder after crawling. Suddenly it froze, its eyes locking onto mine, and I could sense a hint of fear. It seemed more frightened of me than I was of it. We held each other's gaze for what felt like an eternity, though it was likely just a split second. Then, without any movement or sound, it vanished from my sight, as if it had simply blinked out of existence. Naturally, I was filled with terror and dashed out of the room to tell my parents. They came to investigate, but in the end, I couldn't tell if they truly believed my story. My theory is that if it was real, I encountered an extra-dimensional being that day, and yes, my day was completely ruined afterward. When I was younger, my family and I moved into an old house in England that was in pretty rough shape, requiring significant renovations. For personal reasons, I had to share a room with my mother, where most of my ghostly experiences would unfold. Upon entering our room, you would see a wall on the left and my small bed on the right. My mother's bed was snug against the left wall, accompanied by a tiny nightstand. This all transpired over about 7 years. Initially, things were subtle, like my siblings and I catching glimpses of someone out of the corner of our eyes while playing board games late at night, or feeling as though we were being watched. However, it eventually escalated to actually seeing the entity frequently. Even though I shared a bedroom with my mother, I kept all my toys around me. In my brother's room, we often found ourselves hanging out late at night, either playing games or chatting. However, every time I stepped out of that room, a specific toy would inexplicably fly off the shelf and land right at my feet. My parents, who firmly believed in the paranormal, advised us to just ignore it and not give it any attention. Naturally, we didn't take their advice. As time went on, things escalated, and it felt like the strange occurrences were specifically aimed at me. One night, while I was sleeping in my mother's room as usual, I suddenly woke up and sat up straight. With the faint light illuminating the space, I noticed a small figure hunched over by my mother's nightstand, intently watching her. I didn't have the chance to observe any details because I immediately erupted into screams and tears, alarming my mother, who thought something terrible had happened to me. The moment she woke up, the figure vanished. She comforted me and tucked me back into bed, and I genuinely believed that was the end of it. But in reality, it was just the beginning. From that night onward, it became a regular occurrence. At least 4 times a week, I would wake up in the middle of the night, sit up, and see that same figure looming over my mother. Each time, I would scream and cry uncontrollably. Sometimes my mother would leave a small light on for me next to her nightstand, but it made no difference. The figure continued to appear night after night. Eventually, I began to recognize what I was seeing. It was a little girl with blonde hair, dressed in a dark blue dress adorned with light blue patterns and flowers. Even though I could identify her, the sight still filled me with terror, and I would continue to scream and cry almost every night. Occasionally, the figure would change its position, standing by the door and staring at me instead of my mother, or even coming closer to my bed. My mother eventually grew weary of being awakened by my terrified screams and decided to consult a psychic. I know this sounds unbelievable, but when she explained our nightly experiences to the psychic, she was told that the entity was a little girl named Samantha, who had been following my mother since childhood, serving as a sort of guardian angel. My mother was always under the watchful eye of a presence while she slept. The psychic also sketched an image of a little girl, which my mother later showed to me when she returned home. I couldn't help but burst into tears because, believe me, it was the exact likeness of the girl I had seen before. Since then, we've moved out of that house, and although I no longer live with my mother, I've had many more experiences in that house and others I've resided in. This particular incident took place in February 2020, and for context, I live in central Arkansas. My friend's grandparents owned some farmland located about 15 to 20 minutes from our town. We often spent weekends there with a few other friends. We would gather around a fire, enjoy drinks, and have a good time. But on this specific weekend, it was just my friend and me. By the time we arrived, it was quite dark, but everything felt normal. We decided to set up the fire along the dirt path that led from my friend's grandparents' house, through their field and into the woods. However, this time we built the fire closer to the center of the field. Not long after lighting the fire, we settled down, started playing some music, and cracked open our first beers. Suddenly, my friend turned off the music and pointed out something unusual in the sky behind me since my back was facing the woods. When I turned to look, I saw a bright light hovering above the treetops. At first, neither of us felt particularly alarmed by it, though I had never seen a star shine that brightly before. I pulled out a stargazing app on my phone, which I had kept for ages, thinking we might be looking at a planet or something similar. However, before I could even aim my phone in that direction, the star abruptly shifted position. At that moment, we both froze as the light glided quickly and smoothly to the right, without any bumps or wavering, all while remaining completely silent. That's when I realized the light was emanating from some sort of flying vehicle, and it was much closer than we initially thought, probably around 300 to 400 feet away, soaring above the trees. This thing was astonishingly fast, moving too swiftly to be so quiet without making any noise. It was dark, so I couldn't clearly identify what the vehicle was, and the intense light coming from its side made it hard to get a good look. Yet, it flew perfectly parallel to the tree line, just above it, and seemed to vanish as soon as it realized we were watching. As we kept our eyes on the UFO, it swiftly and silently glided away in a straight path until it vanished from our view. Few moments later, we exchanged bewildered glances, wondering what on earth we had just witnessed, and began to quietly discuss the strange occurrence as if we were in a dream. About 20 minutes later, we heard a noise overhead and spotted two loud planes flying closely together, heading precisely in the same direction as the UFO. At that point, we started to speculate that it might have been some sort of military drone, but after that night, we didn't see or hear anything else, leading us to believe that was indeed the case. However, I still ponder over it from time to time, and the whole military drone theory just doesn't sit right with me. So, I thought I'd share my experience and seek out others' thoughts on it. What do you all think? What could it have possibly been? I'm a 29-year-old woman who used to do street performances when funds were low. This story takes place when I was 25, having recently shed a significant amount of weight and needing to save up for skin removal surgery. This also included buying an entirely new wardrobe and visiting a chiropractor due to changes in my gait affecting my spine. Here's your pro tip. Losing weight can be quite costly, and I wish someone had warned me about that. But that was my reality. So it was a Friday night, and I found myself in a college town near the state university, surrounded by numerous bars and restaurants. Since my clothes hung off me like a tablecloth, I opted for a decorative scarf tied into a makeshift dress, which was a bit revealing but certainly looked better than the rest of my attire. When performing on the streets, if you don't present yourself well with decent clothing and makeup, people often assume you're homeless and can treat you poorly, which is relevant to this tale. I was tuning my guitar while seated in a camping chair outside a couple of bars when around 8:30 p.m., a beige SUV pulled up and parked right in front of me. The driver jumped out and approached me asking, "Hey, do you want something to eat?" I replied, "Oh, no thanks, I'm okay, but I appreciate it." He then returned to his car, but instead of driving off, he just sat there staring at me. At that moment, things felt a bit unusual. However, I was concentrating on warming up, so I didn't let it bother me too much. I had only intended to stay out until around midnight, so I aimed to make the most of my time. It was the transition from dinner hour to the bustling bar scene, which made it take me a while to notice that the beige SUV remained parked and the guy inside was still watching me intently. I suspected he hadn't even bothered to pay the parking meter. Then, around 9:30, he got out again and asked, "Hey, are you hungry yet?" I replied, "No, I'm fine. I ate before coming out here." He insisted, "Come on, I want to get you something, but I don't have any cash. Let me treat you to dinner." This kind of thing happens sometimes. People without cash often offer to buy snacks for street musicians they like, so I didn't find it too odd. "Okay, sure. If you want to bring me a snack, that's cool," I said. "Great. Come with me," he urged. I responded, No, I'm not leaving my spot. There's a really good restaurant I want to take you to, but it's too far to walk. We need to drive there," I explained. Sorry, but I'm not really interested in going anywhere. I need to stay here and earn some money. Tonight? I thought you were hungry, he pressed. Frustration began to creep in as I said, look, I told you I'm not that hungry. If you want to tip me with something other than cash, like a slice of pizza from across the street, a soda or a cigarette, that's fine, but I'm not leaving this spot. No, I'm not buying you a slice of pizza. If you want dinner, you need to come with me, he insisted. By this point, many people were passing by, and his insistence was really starting to irritate me because it was keeping me from playing music. I'm not going anywhere, and I need to make some money tonight, so I'm done discussing this, I declared. To signal that I wanted the conversation to end, I started playing my guitar. Looking back, I probably should have been more concerned, but honestly, I was just a bit annoyed. It wasn't uncommon for men who saw me performing on the street to offer food or shelter in exchange for sex, so I figured that might be what he was after at this point. In the next hour, I immersed myself in playing music and chatting with people, which turned out to be quite a productive evening. By that time, I had nearly forgotten about the unsettling guy until he stepped out of his car and leaned against the door, still fixated on me. At this point, it was almost 11 p.m., and it hit me that he had been watching me for over 2 hours. That's when the alarm bells really started ringing in my mind. After that realization, I struggled to concentrate on my music because he was just standing there, staring at me. The longer it went on, the more I sensed that his intentions were far more sinister than simply trying to persuade a young homeless woman to sleep with him. Around 11:30, I understood that I needed to take action sooner rather than later. It was the peak time for bars, but the streets would eventually thin out and I would need to make my way home at some point. I definitely didn't want to risk him following me. When I'm performing on the street, I'm usually in a friendly mood, and I don't come across as very intimidating. So, I doubt he expected me to confront him directly. However, when I feel threatened, I can get pretty angry quite quickly. Knowing I had plenty of witnesses around, I marched right up to him, furious at this point. "Why are you staring at me?" I demanded. Taken aback, he replied, "You've been staring at me for 3 hours now. Do you just enjoy making younger women uncomfortable?" My anger escalated as I spoke faster and louder, making it clear that this wasn't going the way he anticipated. No, I just want to buy you dinner. So you're just waiting for me to get hungry enough to accept your dinner invitation after I've already said no multiple times? That's not being helpful, it's being creepy. And honestly, I know there aren't any restaurants open around here at 11:30 p.m. anyway. No, this one is still open, he insisted. I responded, "I don't care if it's still open because I don't want to go anywhere with you, and I've told you that. So why are you still hanging around?" He seemed confused, as if he was scrambling for an excuse. "What am I not getting about you staring at me for the last 3 hours? Then he said, "You see, I'm an Uber driver." Out of all the ridiculous excuses he could have chosen, this one was possibly the worst. I can't believe I was so clueless, pretending to understand everything. "All right, I see now that you were just waiting for someone who had ordered an Uber." "Yeah, that's right. I dropped the act, and you were planning to leave them hanging while you took me out to eat. But what happened next really shook me up more than anything else that evening. As soon as I saw through this guy's story, it felt like he removed a disguise. His grin vanished and his tone turned ominously serious as he got back into his car. He looked at me and said, "Okay, you'll never see my face again," before speeding away. I stood there, completely stunned. Sure, I had encountered plenty of strange situations while performing on the street, but nothing like this one. It was hard to shake off the feeling that he might actually try to kidnap me. After that experience, I decided to call for a real Uber to take me home instead of walking, which ended up costing about half of what I earned. In tips that night, while sitting in the back of that Uber counting my cash, it hit me that it was time to hang up my hat. The little bit of money I made during the day wasn't worth the hassle, and the decent earnings I got at night definitely weren't worth the danger anymore. Since then, I've transitioned to a new side gig, and also developed agoraphobia, by the way. due to this and similar incidents. I really dislike going out alone now, so I order most of my groceries and household items through DoorDash. Plus, I have a job that's only 3 blocks from my apartment. Still, during my walks to and from work, I find myself constantly scanning my surroundings, using reflections in store windows to check if anyone is following me. Honestly, I sincerely hope that creepy guy in the SUV keeps his word, and that I never have to see him again. The only other person who knows this story directly from me is my wife. I shared it with her when we first got together in 2021. I was reminded of it recently because we just welcomed a baby at the hospital where I used to work during all of this. This was my first visit back since 2020. My ex-wife and I separated during the pandemic, which turned the divorce and custody battle for our 3-year-old into an absolute nightmare, especially since the courts were closed. Everything was done over Zoom calls, and things dragged on endlessly. I received a job offer from a new hospital, but due to COVID, my start date was pushed back by 10 weeks. So I decided to give my previous hospital a 2-week notice and took 8 weeks off for myself. During that time, I began to realize just how messy my divorce battle had become and the financial strain it was causing. I noticed that my ex was also manipulating those around me, which led me to cut ties with many people close to me. I stopped communicating with anyone who wasn't my attorney, my 2 cousins, or the woman I was dating at the time. With gyms closed, I couldn't work out either. My new job delayed my start date another 6 weeks because they didn't have enough appointments to clear new hires through employee health services for physical exams. By this point, I would be out of work for a total of 3.5 months. While I wasn't on the brink of a mental breakdown, I could feel the pressure mounting as I realized how many relationships I had to sever. Bills were still piling up while my savings were dwindling, attorney fees were increasing, and I missed my son terribly. Without a court order in place, I could only see him when his mom allowed it. To pass the time and try to find some financial relief, I started visiting the only place that remained open, the casino. I quickly found myself spending hours there every day, accumulating play points and receiving offers for free meals and room stays. However, I always returned home each night, hoping that I might get to see my son the next morning. Most nights, I would leave around 2 or 3 a.m., when the action at the baccarat tables, my favorite game, slowed down. There were days when I experienced what you might call casino psychosis, where I would leave without cashing out any chips because I knew I'd be back soon. I'd grab a bit of sleep, then check my phone to see if I could spend the day with my son, touch base with my attorney, shower, and then hit the road again to the casino, which was about 40 minutes away, all while the sounds of the slot machines echoed in my mind from the previous nights. One night I got home around 1 a.m., knowing I had to wake up early. The woman I was seeing at that time lived 2 hours away in San Jose. I was really neglecting my relationship with California, so we decided to make some plans. At 1 a.m., which felt early for me, I pulled into my driveway. My porch light was off, but as my headlights illuminated the area, I noticed a boy who looked to be around 8 to 10 years old standing by my door. I quickly jumped out of the car, worried he might be in trouble. However, when I reached the door, there was no one there. Was convinced I had seen a boy, and wasn't just imagining things due to fatigue. After all, I had experienced paranormal events in my childhood, but never in this house. This led me to wonder if my home might be haunted, especially since it was the first time I had encountered this ghost, or whatever it was, while being alone. Still, I decided to check around the house, listening intently for any creaks or sounds from cabinet doors closing, but eventually, I just went to bed. The next day, I drove to San Jose and stayed there, where I discovered that the boy wasn't haunting my house after all. I spotted him again in a completely different city, where my ex-girlfriend lived in a 3-story townhouse. The master bedroom was on the top floor, with a living room and kitchen on the middle level, while the garage and front entry were on the ground floor. That night, we ordered DoorDash, and when the food arrived, I glanced outside to see the delivery driver leaving. I hurried downstairs to grab the food, car keys in hand since my car was parked right out front. As I bent down to pick up the food, I accidentally pressed the unlock button on my key fob, rolling down the windows. That's when I noticed someone sitting in my passenger seat, pale skin, black eyes, and dark hair, barely visible over the window of my 2018 Camaro. I rushed over to the car, but when I got there, it was empty. I climbed in to roll the windows back up and then quickly headed back upstairs with the food, keeping what I had seen to myself. In the chi. Following days at my ex's place, I didn't see the boy again. But once I returned home and resumed my routine, including trips to the casino, I began to notice the boy more often. Whoever he was, it seemed like he was following me everywhere I went. I would see him at home, in parking lots, and from a distance. He was short, yet oddly intriguing. Surprisingly, he appeared to be in good health. There was one instance where I encountered him, and for 3 weeks he seemed to follow me around without a face. Despite his presence, I wasn't frightened. I think I was just overwhelmed by everything happening around me. Some days, I was more focused on my own distractions than feeling creeped out by him. However, one night, I experienced sleep paralysis and noticed him standing in the corner of my room. His voice whispered in my ear, offering to help me win if I would just take him along for some fun. Managed to shake off the paralysis and eventually drifted back to sleep. Having grown up as a Thai Buddhist, and having had my share of experiences, I understood that it's best not to give in to what spirits want or to test them, as things could escalate quickly. The very next day, I hit a $40,000 jackpot at the baccarat table, and it all happened in a flash. I couldn't make a wrong bet. I doubled down every time, moving from $500 to $1,000, then $2,000, and so forth. It was an exhilarating experience. But when I got home, there he was again, right by the front door, grinning widely as if he claimed credit for my winnings. The following day, I returned to the casino and climbed up to about $1,700, betting $2,500 each time. In the distance, I spotted the little boy laughing at me. That's when I lost everything in just 4 hands, trying to recover from my initial loss. In frustration, I stormed out of the casino. I had attorney fees looming over me, and I really could have used that money for something more practical. Seriously considered grabbing more cash to go back and try to win it all back. But a fight with my girlfriend from San Jose about not spending enough time together held me back. Later that night, as I lay in bed ready to sleep, the little boy reappeared in the shadows. Ignoring all the lessons I had learned growing up, I decided to confront him that night. Gambling had me doubling down on my challenge, and I told him that if he intended to follow me around like this, he would be stuck with me and would end up miserable. I questioned whether I looked like someone who had anything to offer him. If you keep following me around, you're going to end up starving. At that precise moment, I realized I was done shouting at this ghostly child. It felt as if he completely grasped what I was saying, and it clearly wasn't what he wanted to hear. He let out a deafening scream that seemed to reverberate through the entire house, and then he simply vanished. His eyes were the last part of him to disappear, and after that, I never encountered him again, nor did I experience anything supernatural since. In the weeks that followed, the court began reopening for personal litigation, and I obtained a court order to retrieve my son's belongings. Things started moving forward toward finalizing the divorce from his mother, and instead of buying her out, I decided to list the house for sale so we could split the proceeds. I relocated and started working at a new hospital, finally able to concentrate on my job and spend quality time with my son. I also ended my relationship with my ex-girlfriend during that time, and it felt like all the negativity had suddenly lifted, leaving with that little boy. I've only ever shared this experience with my wife, mainly because we joked about my divorce and how we wished we had met during the pandemic when everyone was stuck at home together. I opened up to her about what a challenging year it had been for me. Of course, I have no tangible evidence to prove that any of this actually occurred. Perhaps that's why I don't often talk about it. But honestly, I have no reason to fabricate such a detailed story filled with background information. Reflecting back, I'm starting to think that maybe something was haunting me for some unknown reason, but at the time it didn't feel that way. Sure, there were moments when I jumped or felt startled, but my reactions made it seem more like a burden than a haunting, if that makes sense. Regardless, I'm relieved that it's all behind me. Now, I can't quite explain why any of this happened. I was under immense stress at the time, so who knows? Maybe it was all in my head. Still, the entire experience felt incredibly real to me, and I've never encountered anything like it before or since. I don't believe it was psychosis or anything like that. Looking back, I genuinely feel that I was haunted. This all happened around a decade ago. There I was, cruising home in my old Jeep Wrangler after visiting my girlfriend. It was around 2 a.m., and the darkness enveloped the winding back road, with dense forest on my left and a Christmas tree farm on my right. The road was quite narrow, with hardly any shoulder, just some gravel and grass. I was speeding more than I should have been when I rounded the next bend and spotted a gray Camaro with black racing stripes, possibly an SS from the 70s, parked sideways and blocking almost the entire road. Its headlights illuminated the tree farm, and there was this guy leaning casually against the car, dressed in a leather jacket and jeans, with slicked-back salt and pepper hair, smoking a cigarette. I slammed on the brakes and managed to slow down just in time. Being a trusting person, I thought to myself that he might be having car trouble, so I decided to roll down my window and see if he needed assistance. Before I could even start lowering my window, the guy tossed his cigarette aside and began striding, straight toward me. Not along the roadside or in a friendly manner, but directly into my headlights, heading right for my still-moving Wrangler. He looked furious, which made me think, okay, forget this. He could either be upset about my speed, or maybe even an undercover cop. So I hit the gas and swerved off into the grass beside the road. I whipped around the back of his car, and for some reason, I vividly remember how bright the taillights appeared as I passed by, casting an angry red glow that filled my Wrangler's cabin. Eventually, I got back onto the road and glanced in my rearview mirror, worried that I might have hit him, or that he would be chasing after me. Or maybe I was, just plain scared. Who knows? But when I looked back, there was nothing. No car, no man, no lights from the tree farm, just emptiness. I decided to pull over and get out, thinking I must have driven further than I realized and perhaps rounded another curve. But no. This was definitely the same curve. I had only gone about another 50 feet, if that. In fact, I could see the tracks I had left in the grass where I had initially veered off, and then where I had gotten back on the road. To this day, I wish I had known what really happened. It seemed logical to go back and look for that cigarette butt or any trace of him, but I was far too unsettled by then. Ultimately, I hopped back into my Jeep and drove away. I work at a bar that has a back alley leading to a small, isolated parking lot filled with several large trash bins along with many smaller ones. Occasionally, some homeless individuals wander into the alley, usually harmless, rummaging through the garbage or asking for spare change. However, tonight was different. As I stepped outside to dispose of a bag of trash, I spotted a man hastily moving past a cluster of garbage cans near the back door, the same one I typically use. He glanced in my direction, seemingly unaware that I could see him. But when he noticed me approaching the trash can, he quickly ducked behind the bins, trying to conceal himself in the shadows. I lost sight of him, and it frightened me immensely. I was alone, and it was clear he was hiding there, waiting for me. The thought of that made me uneasy. I decided to leave the trash right where it was and hurried back inside. I hoped he left shortly after I went back in, because the last thing I wanted was for someone to get hurt. If you know the Denver area, I lived in the Clayton neighborhood, on New York Street. Like many millennials, the rental market hit me hard, forcing me to find a place with character. Specifically, a 1920s brick duplex updated in the 1970s, all while navigating life as a recently divorced father with shared custody. My finances ultimately dictated where I could live. To give you an idea of the layout, it was a shotgun-style home, measuring 900 square feet upstairs, with an unfinished basement primarily used for laundry and spider habitation. My daughter and I had rooms at either end of a narrow 10-foot hallway, separated by the tiniest full bathroom imaginable. For the first few months, it felt like just another old house on a busy street, with fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars racing down the road every night. I had to invest in blackout curtains for my room, or else it would genuinely resemble cheap imitation of a disco with all the flashing lights. At that time, my daughter was just 5 years old and struggled to adapt to living between two homes. She often climbed into bed with me in the middle of the night because something had startled her, leaving her frightened. I could feel her crawling over me quite frequently, her hands, elbows, knees, and feet all clumsily navigating across my body. One particular night, around 2 a.m., I sensed her movement again, but this time she wasn't coming into bed. She was attempting to crawl out. I felt her tugging at my shirt, trying to pull me aside so she could slip out through the door. For some reason, this shift in direction jolted me awake, creating an unsettling feeling within me. I rolled over to catch her before she fell off the bed and mumbled something like, "Kiddo, do you need to go to the bathroom?" However, when I turned to reach for her, I found nothing there. My arms crossed over each other as my eyes shot open, instantly worried that she had fallen off the bed. As I sat up, still groggy, I noticed her standing in the doorway. That's when it hit me. It wasn't her. I can vividly recall the face of a little girl who looked close to my daughter's age. She wore a slight smirk, innocent and playful, dressed in a yellow sundress adorned with white flowers. This image is etched in my memory, but not in a terrifying way. I quickly glanced back at my daughter, sound asleep and snoring on the side of the bed, then whipped my head back to where the little girl had been standing, only to find her gone. I've recounted that story countless times, and it certainly wasn't my last encounter in that place. The little girl wasn't the only figure I saw. For a while, the thought of her was quite unsettling. I've never been fond of horror films. The jump scares always made me flinch, but seeing her that night felt different. There were no abrupt cuts to a twisted face or loud noises, just a little girl standing there with a gentle smile. It almost felt like a roommate playing a prank on me. I distinctly felt her tugging at my shirt and the weight on my chest, which confirmed it wasn't just a dream. It was a tangible experience. Honestly, for some time after that, I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I hadn't shared it with anyone, as I didn't know how to convey it without sounding like I was simply dreaming, and I began to convince myself otherwise. It was likely just a dream, but unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, the following day made it much tougher for me to convince myself that I hadn't experienced anything at all. If you're familiar with rec hockey, you know how challenging it can be to find available ice rinks. Most of my B-League games kicked off around 9 p.m. or later. As a single dad, I had really committed to playing, and I needed assistance with my daughter during those late nights. Thankfully, my mom offered to come over and watch her while I played, which provided a nice break in my week and helped distract me from the previous night's events. When I returned home around 11 p.m., I found my mom in the living room engrossed in a book. She approached me and nearly hugged me, but then the odor from my hockey gear hit her. I still vividly recall her looking at me and saying, "So it was kind of a strange night." I placed my keys on the table and asked her what she meant. She replied, "Well, your electric razor turned on in the bathroom a few times." Initially, I brushed it off as a mere coincidence, but then she added, "I kept getting up to check on Lou. It was odd because I thought I heard her running up and down the hallway, and I could have sworn I heard her giggle. But every time I went to check, the door was closed and she was sound asleep. That confirmed it. She had experienced something real. I didn't share my own experience with her. Honestly, I wasn't ready to face it myself. Admitting it meant acknowledging that everything from the night before involving the little girl was genuine, and that she seemed to want to play, or something along those lines. Since then, I've moved in with my girlfriend into a house that feels peaceful and serene. Sitting outside now makes it much easier to reflect on everything that happened. However, After witnessing the girl and hearing my mom talk about the little girl running around and laughing, the house felt more open to unusual happenings. During the summer in Denver, it tends to be warmer than most people expect, and our house lacked air conditioning. Even with fans, it was tough to keep the temperature down, even with the best fan setup. This situation became my first step toward debunking my experiences, as I started to wonder if I was simply having some sort of heat-induced hallucination. I ended up purchasing several swamp cooler-style fans, and while I felt more comfortable, the weather certainly didn't improve my situation. My next suspicion was carbon monoxide or perhaps black mold. I became fixated on uncovering the reasons behind the strange sights, sounds, and sensations I was experiencing. Ultimately, I couldn't find a solution, and nothing seemed to alleviate the discomfort. That summer turned into a whirlwind of experiences that I struggled to remember in sequence, as they occurred frequently, sometimes even daily. The predominant sensation I can only describe as akin to static electricity. I attempted to convey this feeling to others, comparing it to standing near one of those high-voltage power lines. It wasn't something you could hear, but it was palpable as I moved through the hallway from my bedroom to the kitchen and down to the basement. For instance, the basement stairs were old and creaky, and at first I assumed it was just the house settling, which it likely was to some extent. However, there were two particular instances where that explanation fell short. One evening, while brushing my teeth, I distinctly heard my cat's ping-pong ball bouncing in the kitchen and down the steps. This occurred 3 times in a steady rhythm, bounce, 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 on the tile floor, then hitting the wall before continuing down the stairs and finally striking the door leading to the backyard. After the 3rd bounce, I called out to my cat to stop, and I vividly recall peeking out the door into the kitchen, only to find my cat lounging in my daughter's room, completely indifferent. There was no way she could have made it over there so quickly after I heard the last bounce. On another occasion, while working from home with my computer set up in the dining room, I had a clear line of sight from the back door to the front. My desk faced the living room window, allowing me to see into the back room. During a team call with an employee, I suddenly heard footsteps racing up and down the back stairs, prompting me to ask my colleague for a moment. I leaned back and told my cat to settle down, then returned my gaze to the screen, only to freeze, in shock when I glanced down the stairs. To my surprise, I spotted my cat again I was lounging casually on the couch in the main room when I shared my experiences with my staff. One particular employee had the chance to experience it alongside me, which made me feel really validated. The steps we took were clear enough to hear, yet they felt quick and playful. They had also picked up on it, and if it wasn't a cat, then it was something small and inquisitive. Honestly, I'm not quite sure how to put it into words. The next part is tricky to articulate, but I'll give it a shot. As more occurrences unfolded, I began discussing it more openly during phone calls or team meetings. Whether I was in a room, hallway, or kitchen, whenever I mentioned the little girl, I could suddenly sense her presence around me. It felt like the surrounding sounds faded away, similar to the sensation you get when you faint. Like everything, muted to a soft ringing, almost like tunnel hearing instead of tunnel vision. That was a significant trigger for me. Following that, I would experience classic goosebumps, along with an inner radar that allowed me to visualize a specific area of the room in my mind. Often it was the hallway, and I'd get this feeling of, "Hey, look here." All 3 sensations would amplify, prompting me to consciously say no and step away to break the connection. To be honest, I don't think I'm doing justice to just how persistent those feelings and subtle sounds were in that space. I only managed to sleep with headphones on. Nothing ever felt malevolent, but I struggled to keep pace with the constant energy and movement. I needed rest, yet everything felt too curious around me. It got to the point where I frequently sensed a little tug or pressure on my bed. I even stopped letting my cat stay in my room to help alleviate that, but it continued. I confided in my mom about everything, and for my birthday, she mentioned her friend who was supposedly a medium. Despite my personal experiences, I had serious doubts about the whole thing. so I made sure not to provide him with any information beforehand and asked my mom to do the same. When I arrived at his house, we sat down, and I did a tarot reading. It was my first time. After that, we did some cleansing and used dowsing rods as well. At that moment, my inner skeptic really kicked in. Here I was, holding 2 rods. The rods seemed to be connecting with the spirits of the deceased. I held them in my hands, but nothing occurred. I posed a few questions, and they moved weakly, yet there was no significant response. I recall him suggesting that I ask a broad question about anything, so I took a moment and inquired if I should leave my home. The rods remained still, but he looked at me and said he wanted to discuss my house, mentioning there was a girl there, wasn't there? I nodded and confirmed it was my daughter, but he smirked and insisted that I had seen a little girl, perhaps in a bedroom, hallway, or on the stairs. Someone very playful. I remember setting the rods aside and asking what she appeared like to him. At this point, I was curious if I was giving off any hints that could clarify everything. He described her as not being from this time, envisioning her in a homemade sundress, likely around the same age as my daughter, surrounded by flowers. Found myself captivated by his vivid description of the girl. She enjoys playing at night, doesn't she? You have balls that she throws for you, or maybe a pet, he continued. She isn't malevolent, she just likes having kind people around. And he added that she wasn't the only presence in the house. Whether I fully grasped it or not, I had come to terms with the little girl I had encountered. But there was something else lurking in the house, something older and larger. At times, the sounds I heard and the energy I felt were different, heavier and far less playful. Hearing him say that made me uneasy. He explained that the girl was someone I could communicate with, almost like a parent, especially if I needed a quiet space while she played. However, when I shared my experiences of feeling a tunnel and hearing visions of where people were, he warned me to be cautious. It seemed I might be sensitive, and while thinking about these things was one matter, directly communicating with them could lead to an attachment. That day, the drive back home felt exceptionally long. 2 nights later, as I lay in bed, I heard books on my shelf being flipped through. Initially, I attributed the noise to the fan, but after about 5 minutes of the sound continuing, I turned the fan off, yet it persisted, resembling someone browsing through books. I quickly sat up 2 or 3 times, shining my phone's flashlight in an attempt to catch a glimpse of something, but there was nothing to be found. After one last try, I switched off the flashlight and settled on my bed. I told myself it was time to sleep and asked for some quiet in the room, urging everyone to go to bed. Suddenly, all the sensations overwhelmed me, the stillness, the goosebumps, and the awareness of where she was. Then, silence enveloped us, and it remained that way. I expressed my gratitude and drifted off to sleep. On August 11th, 2001, I can easily recall the exact date because it coincided with the premiere of Samurai Jack on Cartoon Network. At just 8 years old, this was a significant event, so naturally, I had a sleepover at my best friend Kay's house. We decided to sleep in the living room so we could watch TV as we dozed off. I was sharing my new favorite movie, Titan AE, when around 3 a.m., we were startled awake by the sound of decorative indoor wind chimes. For some inexplicable reason, they were going wild, as if there were actual gusts of wind inside the house, while simultaneously, it sounded like a whole bunch of cats were fighting outside. Being kids, we were terrified and opted to tell her mom that we would be moving to the bedroom for the rest of the night. When we opened the door to the room where her mom and her 12-year-old sister were supposed to be sleeping, we found the bed empty. Kay climbed in and exclaimed, "What the heck, there's no one here." We figured they must have moved to another bedroom, so we began searching through the 3 other rooms, but they were nowhere to be found. We started flipping on every light in the house, growing increasingly frantic. The doors were locked, the keys were hanging on the rack, and the car was parked in the driveway. Kay was panicking, convinced that her mom's stalker had escaped from prison and kidnapped both her mom and sister. The next thing I remember is waking up to sunlight the following morning, back on the living room floor as if we had never gotten up. with no recollection of falling back asleep. Strangely enough, we both vividly remembered searching for her mom and sister. So, as soon as we saw them, we began to interrogate them about what had happened. Fortunately, Kay's mom is quite open-minded and actually believed that we weren't fabricating the story, which was odd in itself. To this day, her mother recalls the details of that night, but sadly, my friend has somehow forgotten. I had completely overlooked the fact that it even took place. Typically, when I share this story, I receive a somewhat dismissive response. My husband thinks it was just a dream or perhaps sleep paralysis, which I'm open to considering, but seriously, it doesn't feel like that to me. I'm curious about how Kay could forget something we used to discuss so passionately as we grew older. Some people have suggested that I reach out to her mom and sister to see if they still remember our story. I plan to do that soon, but they're currently dealing with some issues, so it wouldn't be right to disturb them at this time. However, during our last conversation, she did recall the event and vividly remembers that night. Now, here's a rather strange story I only discovered last week. I'm 26 years old, and I asked my parents why I'm the only one among my siblings who knows Urdu, a Pakistani language. We all know our parents didn't teach us and they hardly speak it at home, only when communicating with family abroad, and even that wasn't frequent enough for me to pick it up. My mom told me that my great-grandfather taught me Urdu, but I mentioned that I don't remember him. She explained that he passed away shortly before she was born. Apparently, when I was around 2 years old, I had an imaginary friend who shared the same name as my great-grandfather from my mother's side. It's quite a rare name, and growing up in America, I doubt I've ever encountered it elsewhere. My mom said I would converse with him in English, and he would respond in Urdu until I became nearly fluent by the age of 3. To be clear, I don't recall any of this, but after learning about it, I had a peculiar dream last night, where I met my great-grandfather. In the dream, he told me he taught me Urdu because he was weary of seeing his family lose their cultural heritage. I attempted to speak back to him, and remarkably, he spoke to me in Urdu, which has never happened to me before. I promised him I would make an effort to learn more about my culture, and asked if he wanted me to convey anything to his family. He specifically mentioned my youngest uncle, and asked me to tell him not to ride his motorcycle too fast, as that was how his father had died. A few hours ago, I woke up and asked my mom how her dad passed away. He mentioned that he was involved in a motorcycle accident due to speeding, and it seems he ended up sliding underneath a garbage truck. I quickly reached out to my uncle in Pakistan, urging him not to drive carelessly. I shared with him that his grandfather visited me in a dream and conveyed this message. I'm uncertain about how my uncle received that information or what's truly happening, but it's also strange and fascinating that I feel compelled to share it. I'm completely bewildered yet simultaneously captivated by the entire situation. I wish to learn more from him and have another conversation, but I'm at a loss for how to initiate that. Has anyone else experienced something similar? If so, how did you handle it? About a decade ago, I had an encounter that still leaves me searching for answers. I'm particularly interested to know if anyone else has seen humanoid figures resembling those I'll describe, as I've struggled to find any accounts that match my experience over the years. This incident took place in late winter or early spring of 2015 in upstate New York. One morning, after my husband and child had left for the day, I felt exhausted and decided to go back to bed around 8:30 a.m. I distinctly recall dozing off when the bedroom door, which I was facing, quietly opened, and 2 or more humanoid beings entered. They were completely silent and approached me so swiftly that I could barely comprehend what was unfolding. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in my bed, realizing that over 3 hours had gone by, which felt impossible. I vividly remembered the beings right away because I was perplexed about how time had slipped away. After a few moments, the memory of what I had witnessed before drifting off came rushing back, filling me with dread and confusion. I almost immediately began to doubt myself, convincing myself it was merely a case of being in and out of a dream state. Yet the image of these entities remains clear in my mind. leaving me puzzled even now. Here's how I would characterize these beings. They had a light off-white hue and lacked any distinguishing features. No eyes, ears, nose, genitals, nipples, or hair. They appeared to be of average male height and build, resembling humanoids with skin or some kind of outer covering that looked almost like wide white fabric. It was like an ace bandage or something similar, tightly and freshly wrapped, resembling a mummy. However, there seemed to be skin underneath, or at least I assumed it was skin. Perhaps they were disguised. What truly astonished me was that they had no eyes at all, not even slits in their fabric-like skin. I should mention that this isn't my first encounter with the supernatural, but it's definitely the one that has left me the most puzzled and made me question if I've been abducted. Can anyone else relate to this experience? Have you ever heard of anything like it or witnessed something similar? Recently, my daughter has been waking up and immediately mentioning that Grandpa is dead as soon as she opens her eyes. She asks, "Why is Grandpa dead, Mommy?" My father passed away 6 weeks ago, so I calmly reassure her, saying, "Yes, Grandpa's in heaven now, sweetie." However, last night she woke up at 2 a.m. in a panic, claiming something bit her. We usually sleep together, and this is unusual behavior for her. I figured it might just be a bad dream, but she was really upset, insisting, "Mama, I don't want to stay in this room. Let's go downstairs, I'm scared." Today, while she was using the toilet, I overheard her saying, "You're bad, stop it." Curious, I went around the corner and asked who she was talking to. She pointed and stared, saying, "This boy here, he's a bad boy." I asked, "What boy?" She looked at me and then back to the same spot, repeating, "The boy here, Mama, he bit my toes." I thought this was strange but went along with it, asking if he was tickling or biting her toes. She insisted he was biting them and called him naughty. Imaginary friends are common at 2.5 years old, but I found myself wondering if I should burn some sage in my home or something. This whole situation has me feeling a bit uneasy. This incident occurred back in October, around my university, specifically the Thursday before Halloween. I went to the student union for lunch and noticed a couple around my age that I hadn't seen before standing in front of me in line. Right away, I sensed something was off about them. I made brief eye contact with the girl while ordering, and she appeared to be waiting for her drink. The odd part was that I saw pure blackness emanating from her. I returned to my apartment feeling a bit rattled by the earlier incident, but as the day went on, I managed to push it out of my mind. Later that evening, I decided to hit up a bar with my roommate, who goes by the nickname Prop. There are 2 rooms in the club that I usually visit, and I made my way into the second room to grab a drink. As soon as I walked in and got my drink, I spotted the same couple I had seen at the student union earlier that day, just dancing away without a care in the world. This marked the last clear memory I had for the next 4 hours. After that, my recollections became hazy, lasting only about 10 seconds each time. My next full memory was of me slumped over on a park bench, while Prop and his girlfriend were ordering us an Uber back to our place. It's worth noting that I had only a few drinks throughout the night, definitely not enough to black out or even throw up. Yet what followed was the most intense vomiting episode of my life, which continued into the next evening, surpassing even the severe food poisoning I experienced as a toddler and the times I've overindulged in alcohol. The following day, Prop informed me that he and his fraternity brothers had been searching for me at the bar for over an hour. Unable to locate me, they thought I had gone home since I wasn't answering my phone. He mentioned that he ordered an Uber as soon as he finally found me after waiting for more than an hour. Apparently, I was standing there, mumbling with my eyes rolled back, looking as if I were possessed. Prop said he had never felt so confused or scared in his life, despite being one of the biggest skeptics and tough guys around. Since that night, I haven't encountered that couple again, but I do have a few unsettling memories or dreams where they appeared. I suspect this might have been a black-eyed human encounter, perhaps an entity that followed me, or even an alien abduction disguised as humans, something along those lines. This isn't the only strange occurrence I've experienced. A series of remarkable events on Sunday prompted me to share this story. I also know a friend who had a similar experience at his university, though I'm uncertain if our experiences are connected. For the first time in our home last night, my wife and I both experienced separate unusual events within about 30 minutes of each other. We had just returned from a week in Miami, and on Sunday night my wife was feeling pretty. I was completely exhausted yesterday and hit the hay around 9 p.m. After a while I stayed awake until about 11, so. Our master bedroom includes the sleeping area, a bathroom, and a reading nook where we keep a treadmill. The treadmill is positioned so that it faces away from the bathroom and looks out the window, making its screen visible from the bathroom. The screen is quite large, almost like a small TV, and when it's not in use, it dims to standby mode, glowing softly. As I entered the bathroom and switched on the light, I found myself looking into the treadmill room, which is roughly 25 feet, from where I stood at the doorway. In the dimness of that space, the rectangular screen was partially obscured in the bottom left corner by a round shape. It appeared as if someone was holding a balloon right in my line of sight between me and the treadmill. I couldn't make out any distinct features of whatever was blocking my view. It was just a dark circle. I flipped on the second bathroom light, and when I glanced back into the treadmill room, there was nothing there, allowing me to see the entire rectangular screen clearly. I searched the room but found nothing unusual. Dismissing it as a trick of the light, I brushed my teeth and eventually settled into bed. I didn't feel scared or uneasy at all. However, about half an hour later, I placed my phone on the nightstand and turned over to sleep, when my wife suddenly bolted upright, exclaiming in panic that there was a bear in the room. At that moment, I started to wonder if I had actually seen something and if there was indeed someone in our house. We shone a flashlight around the room, but of course there was nothing there. My wife even got up to check under the bed. After we calmed down, we managed to go back to sleep. Today we talked about it, and she mentioned that she saw a black bear approaching her side of the bed, although she couldn't tell if it came from the bathroom or the hallway. It seemed to crouch down next to the bed, which is when she panicked, and then it vanished. For context, we purchased this house in 2021, and we've never encountered anything like this before. What do you all think? Was it just a coincidence, or did she see something while still half asleep? Does seeing a bear have any significance? I'm open to any thoughts, as this situation has really left me puzzled. I was likely around 11 or 12 years old when this incident occurred, living in a small town in Florida called Mulberry. Our town had just a McDonald's, a local corner store, and a few mom-and-pop shops, all spaced about 10 to 20 minutes apart by car. My neighborhood connected to Highway 60, which is known for being a dangerous area with many accidents. One evening, around 11 p.m., we decided to grab some McDonald's for dinner. Since my dad was a truck driver, it wasn't unusual for us to eat late. My brother, who was probably between 18 and 20 at the time, came along with me, and we headed to the restaurant. The streets were pretty quiet, and thankfully, the drive-thru was empty. We were chatting about something on our way back when suddenly, everything went silent. On the right side of the road, there was a woman walking, and there was something peculiar about her gait. Her arms didn't move with her steps. They just hung down at her sides. She walked at a pace much slower than normal, and she wore an incredibly long white dress that looked almost pristine. I remember my dad chuckling nervously, questioning why she would be dressed like that at such a late hour. The strangest part was that after we drove past her, none of us could remember her facial features at all. We all recalled her long hair and the flowing dress, but when it came to her face, we collectively drew a blank. When I glanced back, she was still moving in the same direction at the same slow pace, and then she quickly faded into the darkness, almost as if she vanished. I'll admit it's entirely possible that we were just spooked by the late hour, but this memory has always lingered with me. It was quite uncommon to see anyone walking along the roadside there, especially at night. There really wasn't anywhere for her to be heading at that time, except perhaps McDonald's, which was only serving through the drive-thru. Considering the direction she came from, there were no houses or buildings for miles, suggesting she must have been walking for at least an hour to reach where we spotted her. Plus, not many people ventured near the highway due to the high accident rate I mentioned earlier. Something about that encounter has always stood out to me, the way she walked and the eerie circumstances surrounding it. We couldn't recall her face quite like that. It felt as if she simply vanished into the darkness, which still seems unsettling to me even after all these years. Let me take you back to when I was in first grade, probably around 6 years old. Now, at 19, I remember living in a rundown trailer park in a small town. A lot of unfortunate events took place in that trailer, and I often attribute it to whatever had been there before us. Honestly, I'm not sure where to begin. I'm no writer, but I feel compelled to share this story. I don't have many memories from that time, mostly just snapshots, but they are all filled with negativity, very dark memories. My parents were both heavy drinkers, relying on each other to keep going. My mom worked at a place that sold or rented RVs, while my dad was a mechanic who took any job that paid him, which meant they had enough money to drink almost every day. I learned to recognize the signs. Once one of them came home with a few cases of beer, it was time for me to hide away. The atmosphere in that trailer would shift dramatically once they started drinking. Anger, yelling, and various forms of abuse became the norm. One night, as I lay asleep facing the wall, I suddenly felt a sharp slap on my back. Terrified, I turned around, initially thinking it was one of my parents. I looked under the bed, then dashed to their room to tell them what happened. My mom later said she had never heard a child scream like I did. They rushed into my room, flipped on the light, and from my frantic explanation, my mom gathered that something had struck me. When they lifted my shirt, they discovered a large red handprint on my back. They moved me into their room, and I ended up sleeping with them until I was about 10. After that experience, I never slept facing the wall again until I was around 17. It's interesting because my mom mentioned that she had been chatting with my aunt on the couch either before or after that incident. My aunt was facing the hallway while my mom's back was turned. Suddenly, my aunt's expression went completely pale, and when my mom turned around, she saw nothing. Curious, she asked her sister what she had seen, and my aunt needed a moment to collect herself before she could explain. My mom claimed she witnessed what appeared to be a little old lady, around 4 feet tall, draped in some sort of sheet or cloak moving from my parents' room toward mine. However, there was a large tail trailing behind her. They were completely sober that day, and still insist on the story to this day. I had asthma and ended up in the hospital due to a mix of chicken pox and pneumonia, and at one point, I even lost my hearing. Living in that house was just dreadful. When I was about 10, I moved out with my mom and later drove by the place to see it being torn down. Now I find myself curious about what might have happened there before we moved in or how that strange entity ended up residing in that old house. It was undoubtedly ancient, and I'm just relieved that whatever it was didn't follow us. This incident took place roughly a year ago when I was living in Logan Heights, San Diego. My apartment was the side entrance of a duplex, conveniently located next to a park. One night around 11 p.m., I was engrossed in playing Call of Duty with my front door open and the screen door locked to keep the cool air in. While gaming, I heard screams outside, initially thinking they were part of the game. But then I heard it again, accompanied by a woman's scream. My friends on the headset noticed it too and asked what was happening in my home. I told them I thought it was just the game and that nothing was wrong in my house. Curiosity got the better of me, so I stepped outside to investigate. Right across the street, I saw a man pushing a woman around and hitting her as she screamed. She managed to pull out her phone, but he snatched it away and hurled it across the road into my fence. He didn't notice me, then dashed around the corner while she went in the opposite direction. I quickly ran after her, trying to offer assistance. However, she kept walking, casting a blank stare over her shoulder at me. I asked if she had somewhere safe to go, but she didn't respond. When I inquired if she needed help, she replied in a shaky voice, "Go away." Just as I was about to head back to my house, the man reappeared around the corner, yelling at me. He warned me that I was getting involved in something that didn't concern me, and I felt an unsettling vibe from him. That guy then slipped his hand under his shirt and questioned if I was trying to get shot. I stepped back and apologized, explaining that I didn't mean to intrude. I just noticed her crying and wanted to check on her. I told him I'd let him take care of it. As I walked past him to head home, he started following me. In a panic, I began sprinting, running all the way around the block, taking the back entrance into the alley before going inside. I immediately called the police, and within 5 minutes, 5 squad cars rushed by my house. I'm still uncertain whether they actually apprehended the guy or not. Recently, I landed a job at my local liquor store, which is only 5 minutes from my place. I genuinely enjoy this job because it's laid back, and being a local, I already recognize many of the regular customers. This position has also reconnected me with several people I hadn't seen in years. One day, an old high school friend named Steve came in. He remembered me, even though it had been a while since we last met, so we had a great conversation and made plans to catch up with a mutual friend soon. We reminisced about how our mutual friend would tell these outrageous stories that seemed completely fabricated. For instance, he once claimed he got shot in the leg, but the details changed every time. I joked with Steve that our mutual friend was like Paul Bunyan with all his tall tales. Steve laughed and agreed, saying, "Yeah, totally, bro, he is Paul Bunyan." I recalled that Steve had purchased some beatboxes, a popular alcoholic drink at my store. I even remembered the specific flavor he chose and asked him if they were any good, to which he replied, "Yeah, they mess you up." About a week later, when I arrived at work, I noticed my coworker Diane was acting oddly, leading me to believe she might be dealing with something difficult. She asked if I remembered Steve, and I confirmed that I did. She then informed me that he had passed away. When I inquired if it was due to an overdose, she clarified that it wasn't, but added that she felt it wasn't her place to share more details. The true reason behind the death is something I've been pondering. After giving it some thought, I resolved that the next time I encountered Diane, I would clarify that I've known Steve since high school, and he's not merely a local customer I met at work. A few days later, I ran into Diane again during my late shift, which typically runs from 9 p.m. to 2 a.m. Just as I was about to speak with her, the manager arrived, prompting Diane to head out front for a chat. I allowed them their moment of girl talk for a bit, before stepping outside to inform the manager that I needed to use the restroom quickly. While outside, I overheard Diane mention something like how unfair it was that the wife would have to pay for cleaning up the mess left behind. The manager responded, confirming that she would likely receive a bill for the cleanup. Hearing this news filled me with sadness for my friend Steve. I returned inside, lost in thought for a few minutes, then went back outside to find Diane and the manager looking at me as if they knew I had overheard their conversation and were waiting for me to bring it up. I decided against mentioning it right then and opted to wait until I was alone with Diane to address the matter. When we finally spoke, I shared that Steve and I were friends from high school, and this prompted Diane to open up to me. She revealed that she had an ex who had experienced a similar tragedy a few years prior. She shared a lot about what was happening, including that Steve had welcomed a newborn just 2 days before the incident, along with another son who was around 4 years old. Diane mentioned that Steve's partner had been with him for 8 solid years without any significant issues. Diane told me that she had known both Steve and his girlfriend since first grade. They all grew up together. She recounted a moment when she was driving with Steve's girlfriend in the back seat, and the widow finally managed to catch some sleep while Diane was behind the wheel. It was then that the 4-year-old asked where his dad was and why he couldn't see him anymore. Diane told the child that his father was with God. This whole situation is just so tragically sad, because now the poor child believes that God has taken his dad away, leaving him angry at God. So here's where things start to get a little peculiar. That night I went to restock drinks in the back around 1 a.m., and suddenly I felt like I wasn't alone. It was as if someone familiar was with me, even though I couldn't see them. I had this instinct that my friend might be trying to reach out to me. I know it sounds odd, but I promised myself that if I encountered anything unusual, I would stay calm and relay any message I could. I picked up the same drink I had sold him last time and placed it on a shelf. As I bent down to grab something, else that drink I just set down was suddenly knocked off the shelf with a loud crash, almost like someone was upset and took it out on the cup. Understandably, this made me quite uneasy, so I called some friends to hang out with me for the remainder of my shift. To help ease my nerves, I even took a few shots of whiskey. Later that evening, I shared my experience with my mom. She suggested that perhaps he was feeling frustrated about his own choices and the realization that it was too late to change them. Being a Buddhist, she offered me a prayer to play at work to invite positive energy. The next day, I played the prayer while working, and she even joined me for part of my shift. During the prayer, a foam cup mysteriously flew across the room, and both my mom and I witnessed it. This time, however, it felt different, more serene, lacking any anger. I know it sounds strange, but that's how I perceived it, almost like he was acknowledging the prayer. My mom believed this was his way of trying to communicate. In my view, the prayer worked as intended, and I sensed that he found peace. The gentle toss of the foam cup seemed like his way of saying, "Hey, sorry for scaring you earlier. It's time for me to move on. I really miss my friend, and I hope anyone who hears this and is facing tough times can push through and choose to keep living." Paths like these are never the solution and only lead to more suffering for everyone involved. I often find myself reflecting on all of this, and honestly, I struggle to comprehend it fully, except for the fact that something otherworldly occurred. For a bit of background, I'm in my mid-20s, working in marketing and sales. I have a girlfriend, a son, and we're expecting a baby girl soon. I don't smoke, drink, or take any medications, and I don't have any diagnosed mental health issues. I had a healthy and happy childhood, and I continue to lead a joyful life. Today, while I work hard, I also recognize that I'm fortunate in many aspects. I feel compelled to share my experience in hopes of connecting with others who might have gone through something similar. My earliest memory dates back to when I was around 3 or 4 years old. The best way to describe what I experienced is like being a robot powered on for the first time. Everything was pitch black, yet I was aware of my consciousness. For about 5 to 10 seconds, I couldn't see anything at all. Then gradually, I began to perceive my surroundings, but everything appeared in shades of black and white. As my eyes adjusted, I found myself sitting in what I believe was my parents' kitchen, fixated on a white tumble dryer, with clothes spinning. Inside, I felt completely immobilized, and there was an eerie silence enveloping me. A sense of helplessness washed over me. It was a strange sensation. Suddenly, darkness engulfed me once more, but my awareness remained. It felt as if I had just become aware of my own existence, and I was overwhelmed with fear and helplessness, not wanting to be trapped in darkness indefinitely. I was utterly confused about what was happening. The darkness seemed to stretch on endlessly until I finally regained my sight. When I opened my eyes, I found myself in a pitch-black world, surrounded by towering white structures resembling pillars, with figures made of white smoke hovering above them. I couldn't discern any distinct features, just their overall presence. I estimated there were about a dozen of these figures watching me. The landscape unfolded into what appeared to be a maze, and as I tried to grasp the situation, the ground began to tremble. I quickly turned around, and a massive, perfectly round, white sphere was rolling toward me. Everything was unfolding so rapidly that I was unsure how to react, so I panicked and started running in circles. The overwhelming sense of helplessness and fear makes me sweat just at the thought of it. I sprinted as fast as I could, but the ball was simply too quick. It slammed into me, and I can vividly recall being completely crushed by it. Fortunately, there was no pain, just an intense, paralyzing fear. I remember sensing the presence of white smoke figures surrounding me. Oddly enough, their arrival made me feel safe. I didn't perceive any malice or danger from them. After being crushed, I fell into darkness once more, but this time it felt as if my consciousness had vanished entirely. I don't recall anything until my 5th birthday, after which I have perfectly normal childhood memories, celebrating birthdays, playing with toys, spending time with my siblings, exploring nature, and my first day of school. For many years, these memories were lost to me. It wasn't until I turned about 15 that the first memory resurfaced while I was home alone, engrossed in video games. As those memories flooded back, I began to shake with fear. The sensation was so intense that I experienced my first, and thankfully, only panic attack. I lay on my bed, tears streaming down my face, struggling to breathe. Eventually, I managed to calm myself through some breathing exercises and prayer, which felt strange since I'm not religious at all. After regaining my composure, I found myself feeling depressed for several weeks, grappling with what had happened and where this bizarre memory had come from. I eventually decided to chalk it up to kids experiencing odd things that aren't real. So, that's my unusual first memory story, one I've never shared with anyone before. Occasionally, especially when I'm quiet, reading, or engaged in something silent, that memory resurfaces, and I can vividly relive those moments in my mind. It genuinely feels more like a memory than something I fabricated. Thankfully, I've learned to suppress it, but every now and then, I still remember being crushed by a massive white sphere while something watched over me. It's 4 a.m., and as I recount this, I'm trying to shake off the nerves, but it's proving challenging. I had just drifted off to sleep after a night out celebrating my partner's friend's birthday at the bar. Suddenly, I woke up to what I thought was the sound of my door attempting to open. I questioned my sanity, but decided to send my intoxicated boyfriend to check it out. My boyfriend mentioned that there was a man standing right outside our door. At the same time, a woman was taking her dog out for a potty break. Since he had been drinking, my boyfriend couldn't tell if the two were connected. However, something about the situation felt off to me, so I decided to peek through the peephole myself. When I looked, the man had vanished. I kept watch for about 5 minutes, during which I heard some glass or ceramic shatter. Eventually, I spotted the man walking back in front of our door and then around to the other side of the building. Since we live in a corner apartment, I peered through the blinds of the living room window to get a better look. I noticed the man approaching a car parked right outside my window, which made me feel uneasy, so I quickly stopped looking. When I checked again, he had disappeared. I then moved to the bedroom blinds and saw him being handcuffed by a sheriff. We managed to catch the attention of the security guard through our bedroom window, and he informed us that he had been keeping an eye on the man for some time. I really wish my dog was here. He's at boarding because we went out for the night. His barks would have scared that guy away, and maybe I wouldn't be such a nervous wreck right now. My husband and I have lived in this house for nearly 3 years, and in that time we've experienced only 2 very strange events. Oddly enough, I didn't connect the 2 until just now, and it's got me wondering if there's something unusual going on here. Is there a name for whatever this is? The first strange incident occurred about 2.5 years ago, shortly after we moved in. I remember that much clearly. I actually shared this story elsewhere online. The layout of our house is semi-open concept, where you come down a hallway from the front area into the kitchen or living room, which share the same space but are partially divided by a wall that obscures one side of the living room when you're in the kitchen. One evening, while I was cooking dinner, my dog was lying at my feet, likely hoping for some food to drop. My husband walked down the hallway and turned into the living room without saying a word. My dog immediately got up and followed him into the living room. As I continued to talk about some work gossip while cooking, I realized I hadn't received any response from my husband for several moments. A few minutes after I placed the food in the oven, I headed to the living room, intending to sit down with him while we waited. However, when I rounded the corner, he was nowhere to be found. Our dog was lounging on the couch all by itself. Just a moment later, I heard the basement door creak open, which is quite loud, so there's no way he could have gotten up and slipped away while I was chatting with him. Plus, it would have been impossible for me to miss him walking back through the kitchen if he had gone anywhere else in the house. When he finally walked into the living room, I immediately asked if he had been there just a minute ago. He looked genuinely perplexed and replied that he had been playing video games in the basement for over an hour at that point. It felt eerie and unsettling, but we both shrugged it off, thinking it would make a great spooky story to share with friends who were coming over. Then, about 6 months ago, roughly 2 years after the first incident, something else happened. I usually wake up suddenly from dreams and then become fully alert right away. It's just how I am. One night I jolted awake while it was still dark outside, though it was early morning. We now have 2 dogs that sleep in the corner of our bedroom, and my back was turned to them. Suddenly I heard my husband's voice, unmistakably clear, softly whispering sweet things to the dogs like, "You're such good boys, and I love you so much." This behavior is totally typical for him, so I didn't think much of it. I rolled over to tell him how sweet he was being, only to find that he wasn't there at all. He was completely absent from the bedroom. It was just me and the dogs in the dark. I couldn't tell if they were awake, but they were lying quietly. The fact that this entity keeps mimicking my husband really unnerves me. What could it possibly be? It doesn't seem to frighten the dogs and has never done anything except linger around. Should I be concerned? What should I do? As a 25-year-old woman, I've been working at this hospital for a year now. I got promoted in March because the previous night shift supervisor was looking for a better position for himself, so I decided to leverage what I already knew about the hospital. I take on the role of supervisor for my colleagues because I have confidence in myself and my abilities within this hospital. However, I must admit that this place can be quite unsettling. The stories I've heard, the things I've witnessed, and the potential it holds are truly mind-boggling. We have 3 main buildings here, and I'll outline them one by one. First up is our initial major building, which houses a morgue on the ground floor. We utilize this morgue as part of our responsibilities, but thankfully, our involvement has changed significantly over time. Previously, we had to accompany the mortician during pickups to check for any belongings left with the deceased. Now, if we feel uneasy, we can remain in the hallway outside the morgue instead. Of course, we need to inform our shift operator beforehand. Once the deceased is covered and the mortician is ready, we return inside to lock the door. It's crucial that both the cold room door and the morgue door are secured, and we make it our top priority to ensure they are locked each time. Moving on to the second building, which is connected to the first and was constructed in 2018. I'll keep this brief since we're currently facing some issues at that site, but I can tell you that it's also quite haunted. My mom works here, so I know various nursing staff and transporters, including CNAs. We patrol this building to ensure no one gets lost and that our clients feel secure. However, due to the presence of the CCU and ICU, the hallway lights tend to flicker. On one occasion, a nurse asked me to investigate a strange noise we were hearing, which turned out to be laughter resembling that of a child. I reported it, but my co-supervisor advised me to leave the area and not dwell on the incident, simply suggesting I document it in our activity log and inform our superiors about my investigation. Lastly, there's the third building located across the street. I completely avoid going there. In fact, I refuse to enter. I've had personal encounters in that building where I've felt myself being pulled into rooms by an invisible force and even experienced choking sensations. I also experienced being kicked a few times by an invisible force. During our tours and at checkpoints, we conduct scans, and whenever we do interior patrols, it feels like someone is constantly watching us and trailing behind. I've spoken to my fellow weekend officers about this building, and they share similar experiences. They've seen shadows and have been pulled into rooms. Once, while I was on a regular shift, a badge reader showed green even though no one had scanned their badge, and the building was completely locked up. I witnessed a figure dressed in white, ascending the stairs, and my ex-boyfriend also heard footsteps as I saw the same figure. A few weeks later, he encountered something that truly frightened him, while I only heard unsettling noises. My ex-boyfriend was a highly capable guard with plenty of experience, and usually nothing scared him. But that night, whatever was following us shook him to his core. Initially, We thought it was just a person, since it walked into one of our 3 auditoriums, but when we followed it inside, it vanished. The next sound we heard was akin to scratching, like nails scraping against the walls. These walls were quite tall, and that was all we could hear. In the auditorium, feeling overwhelmed, we both agreed that we had enough and decided to step outside. To calm my nerves, I started vaping because I was so frightened and trembling uncontrollably. If anyone has questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Yes, I still work at this location, and will be returning for my shift tomorrow night at 11 p.m., so wish me luck. In my late teens and early 20s, my friend and I were out cruising during early to mid-fall in Southern California, where it wasn't too chilly to have the windows down for smoking. Suddenly, I heard a man shouting at someone, prompting me to look around. We spotted a young woman walking down the street, hugging herself tightly. Although it wasn't freezing, it was definitely too cold for her to be barefoot and wearing just a spaghetti strap top. We pulled the car over and asked if she needed a ride, to which she replied yes. I opened the door to move the seat back and let her climb in, but as she turned toward me, I noticed she was holding a large butcher knife. I quickly slammed the door shut and we sped away, and from that moment on, I never offered a ride to anyone again. Once again, we decided to call the police and inform them so they could investigate. So I'm a 25-year-old woman, and something bizarre happened to me just this afternoon. Every Sunday, I enjoy taking peaceful walks in the forest with my dad, which has become somewhat of a tradition since I was a child, and today was no different. Sometimes, my uncle joins us on these outings, and he did today as well. We followed our usual trails and encountered an elderly man at a fork in the path, someone my dad and uncle clearly recognized. He was heading back towards the village, and they exchanged some small talk before we continued on our way. My dad and uncle walked ahead, chatting, while I lagged behind, snapping photos of the stunning scenery around us. As I walked more slowly and paused a few times, there were moments when I found myself quite a distance behind them. At that time, I didn't think much of it, or realize it could pose a risk. Eventually, we turned to head back home, and as we strolled along, I stopped briefly to capture an image of the trees beside the path. After taking the photo, I inexplicably glanced to my left and was utterly stunned by what I saw. Leaning against one of the trees in the forest was that old man we had encountered earlier, standing completely still and staring intently at me without uttering a word. After the initial shock wore off, I chose to look away and keep walking, too frightened to glance back for most of the return trip. I didn't mention anything to my dad or uncle because it was such an unsettling experience. What frightens me the most is that I can't explain why that man was following us, especially since he wasn't on the path but rather deep in the woods. If he didn't have any sinister intentions, why didn't he say anything and instead just stared at me like that? Honestly, I'm just relieved I wasn't alone that day. I work at a hospital, and last Saturday evening around 6 p.m., I went to the gym located in the basement. That space always feels eerie, but it felt even creepier that day since the hospital was quieter than usual. I was feeling quite uneasy about it. When I finally arrived down there, I stepped into the eerily unsettling locker room. To combat the dreary atmosphere and the flickering lights, I decided to play a sound cleanse that I had just recently discovered. I thought it might help dispel the heavy, dark energy that was palpable in that space. It was clear that something in the environment was disturbed by my presence. I felt more anxious in the gym than ever before. I kept the cleanse playing throughout my time there, yet I still felt incredibly uneasy. Afterward, I went home and treated myself to a movie that Sunday night. The day had been pleasant overall, but as evening approached and the storm rolled in, I sensed some ominous vibes creeping in. It felt like whatever dark presence had taken residence in the basement was now somehow connected to me. By the time I went to bed, I was overwhelmed by a heavy, low energy that weighed down on my mental state. Around 12:30 a.m., I was jolted awake by a voice uttering a curse word in a strange, demonic language right at my forehead. Naturally, I panicked. It felt as if something had blown a bubble into my head that then burst, leaving me with a sense of dread. My immediate thought was that it had something to do with the tourmaline necklace I had been wearing to bed for a couple of weeks. After this unsettling experience, I found it hard to fall back asleep. I played some of the cleansing sounds again, ate something, and stayed out of bed for about half an hour before I could finally drift off. Now, though, I have this nagging feeling that something is trying to invade my apartment. This morning, I accidentally broke a plate, and while I was at the gym, I experienced the strangest headache. These incidents might be unrelated, but they leave me feeling on edge and uncertain about what to do next. This all took place when I was a sophomore in high school during May. I had stayed after school with half of my class for an award ceremony organized by the literature department. My group even won the Best Message Award for our short film. Once the awards were handed out, my friend and I returned to our classroom to change into more comfortable clothes and hang out a bit longer while we waited. We asked our parents to come and pick us up, but at that moment, there were only 5 of us in the classroom. As time passed, 3 of my friends left with their parents, leaving just me and my best friend behind. Half an hour later, her dad called to let her know they were waiting for her outside on the schoolyard. Our classroom was located on the 3rd and top floor, so we made our way down the stairs together. She invited me to join her outside and wait in the area next to security, but to this day, I regret not accepting her offer. Instead, I declined and chose to stay in the waiting area inside the building. I could have gone to my principal's office, where she enjoyed spending time with me and chatting, especially since I was a bit of a nerd and one of the top students in my grade. In the waiting area, there were 5 couches available for both students and parents. As I walked over, I noticed a janitor but didn't think much of him at the time. I set my bags down, but just as I was about to sit, I felt an odd sensation, as if he were watching my every move. It made me feel incredibly uneasy, so I opted to remain standing, clutching my bags in case I needed to make a quick escape. Out of instinct, I glanced up at him, and he continued to stare back at me. It felt like we were locked in a staring contest, neither of us willing to look away. Believe me when I say I wanted to break the gaze, but something held me there. Perhaps it was his threatening presence or my overwhelming fear and discomfort. He then flashed a strange smirk, but with the dimming light, I couldn't quite decipher what it meant. I'm not sure how long we maintained eye contact, but I snapped out of my daze when I spotted a classmate from the previous year exiting the building. In a moment of desperation, I waved at her, and thankfully she noticed. She approached me, saying she saw someone waving, to which I replied, "Oh, that was me. I thought you had already left. I spotted you, so I waved, and you know what? If it's not too much trouble, could you accompany me to the waiting area by security?" As we stepped outside, I glanced back and noticed the janitor still watching me. I was dressed in high heels, a short skirt, and a snug top since it was an award ceremony, and we wanted to look our best. I don't believe this kind of attention is typically directed at women based on their outfits, but I felt his gaze was definitely due to my appearance. While we waited in the area next to security, I felt really anxious, worrying about the possibility of him coming in. Even when my mom arrived and I got into the car, I was trembling a bit and wasn't in the right frame of mind to chat, so I just told her we won an award but that I was too exhausted to talk. Later, I discovered something quite strange. The janitor I had seen didn't actually work at the school. I'm not sure if that meant he was just someone pretending to be a janitor or if he was filling in for someone else. Regardless, I'll never forget the unsettling look he gave me. At 49 years, old and male, I reached a point in my early 20s where I believed life was solely about tangible experiences, nothing more. To start off, let me tell you about a friend from high school named Todd. I met Todd through another guy I'd known since 6th grade. He was genuinely a great person, always positive, loyal, and just a solid individual. Looking back, he was probably the most sincere person I've ever encountered, even to this day. We were around the same age, but when I was about 19, it had been some time since I last saw him. Then our mutual friend called to inform me that Todd's house had tragically caught fire, and he lost his life while trying to save his younger siblings. I can't recall all the details, but I know he made several trips into the burning house, rescuing at least 2 of his siblings before going back in one last time. Unfortunately, the roof collapsed on him, and another sibling just a few feet from the door, resulting in both of their deaths. It was an absolutely horrific event, and I couldn't wrap my head around it. It was the first time I had experienced something like this. A person, aside from an elderly family member I knew who had passed away, came to mind. Fast forward about 4 to 5 years later, I'm driving to a friend's house in the same neighborhood where that incident occurred. I'm roughly a mile away from my destination when I spot someone walking towards me about 100 yards ahead. This individual is dressed in jeans and a dark hoodie, with his hands tucked into his pockets and his head lowered, gazing at the ground as he walks. This image reminds me of Todd. I always picture him in jeans and a hoodie, sometimes with a jean jacket. What really stood out to me was his gait. Todd seemed to have one leg slightly longer than the other, which gave him a distinct limp. I could easily recognize him just by the way he walked. It was quite unique. As I approached him, I sensed that something felt off or unusual, though I couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. When I got closer, I slowed down and stopped next to him, and he halted as well. As we both paused, he lifted his head and looked directly at me from about 10 feet away on this 2-lane road. It was indeed him, and his face radiated an incredible green glow that was beyond anything I could imagine. We locked eyes for perhaps 4 or 5 seconds, and he appeared calm and peaceful, while I was likely in shock. Unsure of how to react, I eased off the brake and coasted about 30 or 40 feet down the road before stopping again. However, I felt too frightened to look back, so I sat there for a moment before finally pulling away and continuing on my way. I've heard people describe how the colors in heaven are supposedly much more vibrant and beautiful than those on Earth, especially in near-death experiences, and I think I understand that now. Perhaps that brilliant green hue was a glimpse of that. Interestingly, just a week prior to this encounter, I had been discussing my atheism with a friend, but now I genuinely believe that Todd was there on that road that day to convey a message to me. There was something deeper to life than what meets the eye. In an instant, my entire perspective on existence transformed. That's essentially what transpired. I've had other experiences since then, but those are more shadowy, and perhaps I'll share them another time. However, this particular memory lingers with me because Todd was a genuinely good person, and I miss him dearly. I want to start by mentioning that I just returned home about an hour ago, and this event actually took place. I've never encountered anything paranormal before, and I always try to approach situations with an open mind. My partner and I enjoy hiking in a local park during the late hours of the night. This historic park in Pennsylvania covers around 3,500 acres and extends into Maryland, with one of its trails allowing passage through all 3 states. The park is primarily dense woods, featuring a creek that runs through it. Typically, we park near an old church that houses a Revolutionary War cemetery, famous for a grave known as the Ticking Bomb. I've explored every inch of this park, both day and night, and we usually take a short loop trail that's approximately half a mile long. We've walked this path countless times without ever feeling anything unusual. Until tonight. We made a spur-of-the-moment decision to go for a night hike and left our house around 10:45 p.m. Instead of taking the usual paved access road, I opted for the narrow dirt path to our regular parking area. About halfway down the rough dirt and gravel road, as we turned a corner, an animal suddenly darted across our headlights. I've never seen anything like this creature before, nor have I encountered an animal of that size in this region that I couldn't instantly recognize. It was somewhere between the size of a dog and a human, moving so swiftly that it almost seemed to fly. A solid black figure with some indistinct features and striking silver eyes. My partner witnessed it too. Being a natural skeptic, I brushed it off, and we both tried to rationalize what we saw. Once we arrived at our parking spot, we decided not to dwell on it and proceeded with our hike as usual. As soon as we hit the trail, we noticed that the frogs and cicadas were exceptionally loud, louder than I'd ever heard them at night in this area. As we continued along the path, it felt like we had to raise our voices over the cacophony of the cicadas. As we tried to lighten the atmosphere with our conversation, I was completely unaware that about 100 meters down the path, my partner had started hearing what he believed were faint voices in the distance. I also noticed that the sounds of the cicadas grew quieter the further we ventured down the trail. We managed to walk about a quarter mile when suddenly, a loud noise pierced through the silence, almost like a glitching microphone or megaphone echoing from afar. My partner later pointed out that there was nothing nearby for the sound to bounce off, which made it even stranger. The moment we heard that noise, I halted and asked if he had caught it too. Not only did he hear it, but he was also trying to convince himself that he was imagining the sounds all along, until I finally acknowledged it. Without saying a word, we both turned around and hurried back towards the car. Running felt like a bad idea, but we knew we needed to get out of there quickly. As we rushed back, an unsettling feeling crept over us, as if something was trailing behind us all the way to the entrance. Once we got back into the car and started driving, the sense of urgency lingered. We traveled down the main road to our first turn, and I experienced a moment of utter confusion as I slowed down. My partner asked if I was lost, and honestly, I was just as disoriented. We had driven this route countless times before. In a split-second decision, I turned right, which thankfully turned out to be the correct choice. The next road ran along the edge of the park, parallel to the trail we had hiked earlier. A thick fog enveloped the area, which hadn't been present on our way in. After spending about 20 minutes at the park, as we passed the spot where we had turned back, another creature dashed across the road in front of our headlights. It looked remarkably similar to the one we had seen earlier, but this time it was much closer and more detailed. Whatever it was, it had silver eyes and appeared to have ears or possibly horns. It moved incredibly fast, either as a blur or some kind of wraith, and honestly, I can't find the right words to describe it. Just thinking or talking about it gives me an odd sensation. It all began when I spotted it darting across the road for the second time. I feel like it's tied to my awareness of whatever that thing was. I can't quite put it into words. There's this intense sensation in my sinuses. My eyes start to tear up, and I experience a peculiar tingling at the back of my skull. Typically, I'm quite skeptical about such things, but this encounter has genuinely shaken me. Right now, I'm on a trip with my two brothers, having just landed in Saigon this morning. After dinner and a few beers, my older and younger brothers, I'm the middle one, decided to chill on a bench in Hawan Park. We were enjoying a quick smoke and chatting away when I noticed a Vietnamese man glancing at us repeatedly while pacing circles nearby. At first, I didn't think much of it, but my instincts were definitely on alert. A minute or so later, I spotted another Vietnamese man dressed as a Grab delivery driver acting oddly and also eyeing us. Both of these men were on their phones, and I suspected they were coordinating with each other. Being in an unfamiliar country, my youngest brother urged us to leave, but it was quite a trek, about 600 meters, to get back to the park exit. We made our way out. I saw both men had hopped on their mopeds and were trailing us through the park, hiding behind trees to watch us, which felt very unsettling. They then passed us and settled on a bench further down the path, seemingly waiting for us to walk by. Aware of their presence, we decided to veer off the path and head straight for the nearest exit across the grass, trying to avoid them as best as we could. We were only about 100 meters from the exit when my younger brother glanced back and saw one of the men sprinting toward us. He took a defensive stance, ready to confront him, and asked what he wanted. The man's demeanor shifted drastically. He shrank back and started speaking very softly. My younger brother and I kept our distance, insisting he leave us alone as we backed away towards the exit, noticing the second man also approaching, clad in motorcycle gear. However, my oldest brother chose to engage instead of retreating. He moved closer to the whispering Vietnamese man to hear what he had to say, while my younger brother and I stayed cautious. My brother was shouting at him to leave, but he just wouldn't listen. It took the Vietnamese guy only 5 seconds to gain my brother's trust. Then, out of nowhere, As my older brother leaned in closer to hear what the man was saying, the Vietnamese guy grabbed him inappropriately. My brother was understandably taken aback. I was ready to confront this guy, anticipating a robbery or something similar, but luckily my brother managed to break free. After that, we started yelling and the man quickly ran away. For some context, both my younger brother and I are competitive MMA fighters. However, the entire situation caught us off guard, and we didn't resort to violence. We simply shouted at them. It was truly a bizarre experience. The takeaway from this story is to be cautious in parks at night in Vietnam, as there are apparently some unsavory characters lurking about. Now I want to share this story as a warning to others. I'm an 18-year-old female living in Maryland, USA, and I work at a well-known burger joint. My job involves standing at the payment window all night long. I pride myself on being friendly because I believe that a smile and a compliment can brighten someone's day. Just the other night, before the creepy encounter, a customer told me how happy I seemed and said she appreciated it, which gave me the confidence to handle what happened next. I'm accustomed to the awkward comments and stares from older men. I guess my friendliness draws them in. Our uniforms aren't revealing at all, yet they seem to think I'm naive. Maybe I am more than I realized, but at least I'm aware of the dangers of trafficking and such. Even so, this particular incident caught me off guard. An older man came through just before 6 o'clock. He pretended not to hear his order and laughed as if we were sharing an inside joke. This kind of behavior isn't unusual for older men, so I didn't see any red flags at first. When I told him the total, he handed me almost all of the money except for the change. As he did this, he waved the cash around, making me chase after it a bit. I managed to grab the money, but again, I thought it was just typical old man behavior, so I wasn't worried yet. He then fixated on the company name on my shirt and asked if that was my name. I don't wear a name tag for this reason, so I joked that I might just change my name to match it. At that point, he seemed to perk up, and I should have recognized the warning signs. He appeared to be a white male in his mid-60s to 70s, driving a compact white SUV with a bach on top. He had some stubble on his face and was continuously holding a phone to his ear throughout our interaction. When I finally started to engage with him, he turned the phone to face me, and in hindsight, I suspect he might have been recording me. At no point did he actually speak into the phone or acknowledge its presence, but he kept asking more probing questions. Interestingly, I share my last name with someone notable from U.S. history, and I know that older folks often enjoy discussing such topics, so I mentioned my last name. However, he didn't react or laugh. He simply accepted it and continued with his questions. That's when I began to feel uneasy, especially since he still owed me change. I mentioned this to him, and he grabbed another dollar to hand to me, but he wouldn't let go of it. He wanted to know my first name, and I avoided answering because I was starting to feel uncomfortable. Despite my hesitation, he clung to the money, practically begging for more information about me. I ended up giving him a name I rarely use, which made him smile as he finally released the cash. I took my change and wished him a nice day before quickly leaving the window to share my strange experience with a coworker. However, just 2 hours later, he returned, and I didn't recognize his vehicle on the cameras until he reached my window. I hadn't thought much about our earlier encounter and was preoccupied texting my dad about whether a chicken sandwich qualifies as a burger, but my stomach dropped when I saw his face again. Have many regular customers, all of whom I would gladly welcome, but I really hoped he wouldn't become one because I'd have to involve the police. He smiled and greeted me saying, "Hey, the one with the last name." And I managed a half smile while wishing we could all wear masks again. I told him his total, and he made me chase the money once more, all while keeping his phone pressed against his ear and facing me. He then began asking even more personal questions, and I tried my best to lie or dodge them, providing zero accurate answers to keep our interaction brief. Some of the questions he asked included how often I work, what time I leave, and how old I am. For the last question, I knew he wouldn't walk away without a number, and I felt a deep sense of discomfort about that. I mentioned that being younger might not be ideal, so I responded with a casual, probably, when he joked about me being of legal age. I made a face at his comment and tried to hurry up with his change. He then asked if I had a boyfriend, which only made me more anxious. My sarcasm started to kick in as I told him that boys can be trouble. He focused on himself, claiming he would treat me well. After handing him his receipt, I wished him a good night, but he raised his hands in protest, insisting he would be good to me. I quickly shut my window and said goodbye. He fussed a bit more, but eventually drove off. When he asked about my work schedule, I suspected he might be keeping an eye on the restaurant too. By this point, I was feeling quite shaky, so I called my mom. She rushed over, and I spoke with my manager about the situation. I wasn't entirely sure of the car's color, so he checked the security footage for me. Shout out to my amazing manager. Continued to watch for the older man at my window, but he never returned. I decided to leave an hour early and instructed my manager not to assign any girls to my window, which he agreed to. Sadly, these kinds of encounters are what turn once cheerful service workers into more reserved individuals. Because of this experience, I've decided to take a few days off. I already have another job lined up, and honestly, I'm looking forward to starting it. To clarify, during our interactions, the man held his phone facing me the entire time, which lasted around 5 to 8 minutes without ever moving or lowering it. I have two theories. Either he was recording me with plans to use the footage later, or he was on a call with someone who I couldn't see. Trafficking wasn't my immediate concern. Rather, I was worried about how vulnerable I could be to being kidnapped on a dark suburban road at night. Yes, after a kidnapping, anything could happen. To me, just because I have a job and people assume my dad lives nearby doesn't mean I shouldn't feel threatened. That's why I left so quickly, getting a ride from a trusted adult. I'm sharing this story to warn others in my area. There was definitely something odd about this guy, that much is evident. To start, I want to clarify that this isn't my personal tale. Rather, it was shared with me by a woman I've known for over 10 years. She had never mentioned it before, but the topic came up when our conversation turned to ghosts. She's not the type to fabricate stories, so I find her account believable. This incident occurred around a decade ago, when she was married to a man, now divorced. They moved into a house owned by her father. Initially, there were small peculiarities, like lights being on in rooms she distinctly remembered turning off, and items disappearing, only to reappear in strange locations. Her husband worked night shifts, leaving her alone with their dogs, and she admitted to feeling uneasy in the house, especially when she was by herself. Her dogs would often stare down the hallway and growl at seemingly nothing. They would rush to the top of the basement stairs, bark furiously, then dash away as if something was pursuing them, only to return and bark again. This behavior could last for hours before they finally calmed down. One night, while she was sleeping on the couch, she was jolted awake by screams emanating from the basement. It sounded as though someone was being brutally attacked. The dogs went wild, and in a panic she left the house and called her husband, who advised her to contact the police. When the authorities arrived, they found nothing amiss. She recounted that these unsettling occurrences happened at least once or twice a week after that. On another occasion, while they were asleep, she woke up unable to move. She tried reaching for her husband but couldn't budge. In that moment, she noticed something in the room, a black and white figure swirling or waving, resembling curtains, though she couldn't see it clearly. Eventually, she managed to get up and went to drink some water. After returning to bed, she fell back asleep. The next morning, she shared her experience with her husband, who revealed that he had encountered something similar. While paralyzed, he had seen a floating horse's head in the doorway, appearing as if it was chewing its own tongue. After getting out of bed, she ventured into the living room where she had, in the fish tank, she described the type of fish she owned, but the details escaped me. It was one of those fish that clings to the sides of the tank, but this one was quite large, at least a foot long. Regardless, when she glanced at the tank, she was horrified to find her fish had been shredded into pieces, and there were no other fish present. Interestingly, her sister had previously lived in the same house, so she reached out to her to see if anything unusual had occurred during her time there. Her sister mentioned that nothing strange happened until she began using a Ouija board, which certainly shed some light on things. While her sister had encountered odd occurrences, they were nowhere near as intense as what my friend was experiencing. They decided to invite a preacher they knew to come and bless the house. When he arrived, they shared their unsettling experiences with him. He then moved from room to room, praying and casting out any malevolent spirits. She recalled that they had landline phones back then, and the moment the preacher started his prayers, every phone in the house began ringing incessantly. After the preacher left, they quickly followed suit. Her husband owned a clock radio with a CD player, set to play a CD as an alarm. Upon returning home, the alarm went off, and the CD played, but it kept skipping to one particular line, "Let this be a warning," repeating over and over again. Throughout all this chaos, she and her husband were constantly bickering, unable to tolerate each other. Her husband began drinking heavily and often stayed out late, leaving her alone in the house for long stretches. One morning, while her husband was home and asleep, she entered the bedroom to watch him lying in bed. At that moment, she was contemplating leaving him and pondering whether the strange happenings in the house were somehow linked to him as she turned to exit the room. She stole a quick glance back at the bedroom while walking down the hallway. For just a brief moment, she caught sight of a creature. It was black and red, and she described it as having a beak-like face. This eerie being had 4 arms and was clawing at the doorframe as if it were pursuing her. In a panic, she turned and ran away. She glanced back, and in that moment it had vanished. That day, she reached out to her sister, asking if she could come stay with her. We've been colleagues for over a decade now, and until then she had never shared any of this with me. As she recounted her story, she kept getting goosebumps. She mentioned that she doesn't usually like discussing it because strange things tend to happen shortly after, like feeling someone touch or nudge her when no one else is around. As I mentioned earlier, she's not the type to exaggerate or spin unbelievable tales. After leaving work that night, she texted me later on, saying that once she got home, she looked up sleep paralysis. The Wikipedia page featured an unsettling image of a woman in bed with what appeared to be a monkey on her chest and a horse's head at the foot of the bed, which really freaked her out. She promised to keep me updated if anything strange occurred in the coming days, but honestly, she hoped nothing would happen. Throughout my life, I've encountered numerous bizarre and otherworldly experiences, but the most vivid ones are from my childhood home. I grew up in a remote area nestled in the mountains, where it took us 45 minutes to an hour to reach the city, navigating winding and treacherous roads. Back in the early 2000s, my family lived in a neighborhood steeped in witchcraft and Satanism, although we only discovered this fact after moving away. Looking back, it all made sense. We spent 5 years in that house, which was 2 stories tall, and included a basement that served as our family room, complete with a separate office. We had removed the door to the office so it remained open, directly facing the couch where we gathered to watch TV together. Next to the office, we placed an electric piano against the wall. To go upstairs, you had to pass right by the office and face the door leading into our garage. This detail becomes significant later, so bear with me. The first year was uneventful, but gradually the occurrences turned increasingly malicious and sinister, to the point where we could hardly endure it anymore. We were likely the only Christian family in our neighborhood. I think it didn't take long for others to notice that we skipped Halloween celebrations. We also avoided handing out candy to the kids in our neighborhood, which seemed to frustrate our community. Despite being friendly and mostly keeping to ourselves, our house became a target for egging and other seemingly innocent pranks, as well as vandalism. It was around this time that strange paranormal occurrences began to unfold after my black cat went missing just before Halloween. One night, while returning home from church close to midnight, we spotted a little boy in a green shirt sitting alone on a sidewalk corner in our neighborhood. My parents felt uneasy because it's not typical or safe for a child to be out at such a late hour. They thought about approaching him, but as we drove past, he looked up, revealing that he had no face, just an empty space where his features should have been. Needless to say, my parents hurried home, and they chose not to share this with me at the time since I was only about 5 or 6, likely to protect me from nightmares. However, years later, they finally recounted the bizarre incident to me. Soon after, odd things began occurring around our house. My mom and I used to take piano lessons together, so one day while my dad was preparing lunch, my mom went down to the basement to practice on the electric piano. Meanwhile, I was in my parents' bedroom, watching a popular children's cartoon called Stanley. While my mom played, a child's hand suddenly emerged from the office room, accompanied by a voice that sounded like a child inviting her to come and play. She assumed it was me and told me to stop messing around. The voice urged her again to join in play, which made her frustrated as she felt I was distracting her from her practice. So, she marched into the office only to discover that no one was there. I'll never forget how pale she looked when I heard her scream my name and rush up the stairs. I remember her asking my dad where I was, and since I heard her, I ran to her, curious about what she needed. She questioned if I had been playing tricks on her, and I assured her I had no clue what she meant. My dad chimed in, confirming that I had been in the bedroom the entire time. In the end, she concluded it must have been her imagination, apologized to us, and returned downstairs. But not even 10 minutes later, she dashed back up the stairs, in a state of panic, exclaiming that she had seen the child's hand once more. In the office, it seemed to reach out to her, and now she was certain that there was no way it could have been me. The rest of the day, she was definitely on edge. Another memorable moment occurred when we decided to watch The Ring in the basement late at night. I know, not the smartest idea. Just as the first jump scare hit, when they opened the closet and revealed the disfigured girl, my dog began barking furiously at the entrance of the office. He charged toward it, but then backed away, as if something unseen was trying to get closer to us. Out of nowhere, the temperature dropped significantly, and I started crying because I felt so frightened and uneasy due to my dog's odd behavior. My dad turned on the light in the office, but there was nothing there. Meanwhile, my dog was still going wild, chasing after something invisible, prompting us to call it a night and head upstairs to bed. My dog had a spacious crate in the garage where he slept, so my dad placed him there before turning in for the night. At this point, we decided to reach out to a minister from our church to come and pray for our safety. He prayed for our protection, but things only escalated from there. A few nights later, we were jolted awake by screams coming from the garage. It sounded like a little girl was being horrifically murdered, the screams so piercing they hurt our ears. My dog was barking frantically, which made it clear we needed to take action. My mom and I crouched behind a dresser while my dad reluctantly grabbed a long, decorative bamboo stick to investigate the garage. He admitted he was trembling as he descended the stairs, and the screaming grew louder and more frantic until his hand finally reached the doorknob. As soon as he touched it, everything went eerily silent. The atmosphere was unsettlingly quiet, with only my dog whimpering and barking. Quickly, my dad scooped him up and rushed back up the stairs. After that, we all started sleeping in the same room. Once we settled down again, my mom and I fell asleep first, but my dad remained wide awake for a while. He claimed he could hear something pressing buttons on the TV remote that was on his bedside table. Too scared to look, he simply shut his eyes and pretended not to notice. He went to sleep, and eventually another day rolled around when my mom was at work, and my dad was outside mowing the lawn. As an only child who wasn't yet interested in AOL's dial-up internet, I had to find ways to keep myself entertained. I started spinning in circles until I became dizzy, but during one of those spins, I caught sight of a man standing in the hallway with a gun aimed directly at me. I was completely taken aback, and because I was so dizzy, I ended up falling over, terrified out of my mind. I screamed for my dad and stumbled towards the front door, too frightened to glance back and see if he was still there. My dad was extremely worried about me in that moment of panic, but honestly, what could he do? What could any of us have done? Eventually, my dad decided to put the house on the market, and it sold to the very first buyer. We left so quickly that it was almost comical. However, those events truly traumatized me, and I've become highly sensitive to spiritual energy. You might even say I'm attuned to negative forces. Horror movies don't really frighten me at all, compared to the genuine fear and anxiety experienced in moments like this. If you've ever gone through something similar, you'd understand. Anyway, if you've stuck around to listen this long, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed hearing about my experiences, and it feels great to finally share them.